Next slide. All right. Just a content warning. This is, the Red Zone is a conversation around sexual violence. The event today will discuss topics surrounding sexual violence and trauma. If you are in need of resources, please visit survivors.org. We will also be putting more resources in the chat as we go through the day. All right, so quickly give you a little bit of information about PAVE if you're not familiar with us. PAVE is a nonprofit. Our mission here at PAVE is we are a movement creating a world free from sexual violence and building communities to support survivors. Our vision is we envision a world free of sexual violence where all survivors are supported as they heal from trauma. A little bit of history about PAVE. PAVE was actually founded in 2001 by Angela Rose, who will be here later, actually, as a student organization at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in response to her own experience of being kidnapped from a shopping mall and sexually assaulted at the age of 17. Since then, it has grown into a multinational 501c3 nonprofit. Our first panel today is going to be on consent, specifically discussing consent in digital sexual violence. Before we get into the, meeting our wonderful panelists, we're going to talk a little bit about PAVE's definition of consent. So before you make your move, we remember that consent moves. That is the acronym we use. It's mutual, ongoing, verbal, enthusiastic, and sober. So what do we mean by mutual? We mean that parties must agree mutually and freely without the use of any deception. No one is withholding information that would cause the other person to not want to engage in sexual acts with them. Ongoing. Consent is an ongoing process that can be taken back at any time. Throughout sexual activity, consent is asked for and given, especially if the sexual act changes to a different sexual act. Consent is verbal, so it must be communicated. Consent is not implied through a look or through clothing. If an individual is unable to verbally consent, they must communicate their consent using their primary method of communication. Especially when we're talking about digital things, things aren't necessarily verbally said, they might be typed. Enthusiastic. It's free from hesitation, coercion, fear, and any other form of influence other than genuine interest in sexual activity. And sober. In order to give informed consent, one should be free from significant cognitive impairment from the use of alcohol and/or other drugs. Consent is certainly more than yes means yes and no means no. All right, we're going to meet some of our amazing panelists today. First one is Izzy Abraham Ravidson. They are a sexuality educator based in Philadelphia. They have a master's degree in sexuality education from Widener University and a bachelor's degree in gender and sexuality studies from Williams College. Izzy co-founded the organization Yes to Consent, which provides anti-oppressive, consent-based, pleasure-focused sex ed to people of all ages, including children, teenagers, parents, and healthcare providers. Izzy is also the author of The Great Big Hug, a children's book about consent and boundaries. I'm actually a panelist on this. Hey, Izzy, as well. So I'll give my little intro. My name is Ashley Badgley. I am the Director of Survivor Support here at PAVE. I'm an advocate and I've worked in violence prevention and intervention for over 12 years. I live in Washington, D.C., and I have experience in both indirect and direct services. Most of my work has been related to sexual violence, but I also do advocate for suicide prevention. I have a bachelor's in journalism from Columbia College Chicago, master's in gender studies from the George Washington University, and a master's in clinical mental health counseling from the University of New Haven. I'm very excited to have this conversation. And then our final panelist is Eva Olson. Eva is a gender-based violence prevention specialist and advocate. She currently serves as the violence prevention coordinator for the University of Idaho's Women's Center. Eva received her bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan and her master's degree from the University of Denver. With a strong commitment to education, awareness, and response to sexual and interpersonal violence, she has contributed her expertise across various higher education institutions throughout her career. So welcome, Eva. We're going to stop sharing the screen and it's just going to be us three. All right, the first question, we're going to put it in the chat here in a moment. First question, when an intimate image is consensually shared with one person, how does sharing that image with others without their permission violate consent? So I'm going to start with you, Izzy.
Great. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I really appreciate this question. I think about this in a few ways. So for one thing, consent is specific, right? Consent is specific for this act, this time, and this person, right? So like if I consent to a hug from my sister, it doesn't mean everyone else in the room is like, oh, look, they're open to hugs right now. I can come over and just like join in, right? Like, no, I was talking to my sister and that's it. And so when we share an image with someone, we are only sharing the image with the person that we shared it with. And so anyone sharing it beyond that is doing it without consent, right? And it just, I think sometimes when things are digital, we can abstract them from the body and the lived experience. But if you think about it, right, like if I chose to be naked with someone in a room in person and they like told someone else they could spy through the wall, right, that would be an obvious violation of consent. And this is a very similar thing just happening in a different medium.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think it's really important to make the comparisons between, people often think like digital things aren't the real world, but they are the real world. So I think it's important to make that distinction and comparisons between physical acts of consensual sexual acts and then digital acts of sexual acts, because it is not just a violation if I, you know, forward an image to someone. It's a violation if I say, hey, look at this picture I just got and show it to someone. And it's never actually shared. It's in a digital platform, but someone else can see it with their eyes. And I think that that's also a really important distinction to make when we're talking about digital sexual violence. It doesn't actually have to exist in the ether, in the digital world. It can just be shown. So how about you, Eva?
So, similar to what both of you have been kind of saying, building off of that, I think a little bit more, the consent is for the intended recipient. And working with college students, I know I've heard a lot, especially when it comes to images that people received that they didn't consent to receiving themselves. The idea of, well, I'm going to show my friends what I just received because I'm so flabbergasted that I even had to receive this and I didn't consent to receiving it. But then we come into more questions of, well, if I didn't give consent to receiving it, then the person isn't also consenting to having other people see it. So it's a variety of consent levels. And when we have this online presence, there's a perceived publicness of online spaces. So people are often think like, well, if you send it to me to begin with, aren't you just like asking for it? And I hate the term asking for it. And we hear it for all different types of sexual violence and interpersonal violence. But sharing your personal information online is not something that you let people do all the time. Just like if you are filling out your email to get on a listserv or an email list, you're not sharing your email or your contact information with everyone else that's on there. You're just sharing it with the people that you're sending it to. And I think we also see this a lot with when I work with students in their parents post pictures. I mean, I know when my parents post pictures, sometimes they're not the best pictures. And then there's another layer to consent where maybe it's not even sexual images, but just online consent in general. If you're going to be sending pictures, if you're going to be posting pictures of another person, you need to get their consent before you even go into sharing that with other people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think you brought up another really good point, similar to Izzy's point of imagine like if someone sends you an image, an explicit image that you did not want, it is a violation of them against you, right? It is still a violation. You are now violating them by sharing it with other people. And if you took that into the non-digital world, if you experienced an act of sexual violence, that is an attack against you, and then you went and committed an act of sexual violence against that person, Like that's, you still did something wrong. And there is nothing wrong with consensually sharing images, like with sexting and doing all those things. But we need to understand that sharing images that we got non-consensually is us, perpetuating another non-consensual act of sexual violence. So thank you so much for that question. We'll go to the next question. Next question is, what do we do if we know an intimate image is circulating about someone we know without their consent? And I'll go back to you, Izzy.
Well, I think there's two important things to do first. One is if you know of someone circulating images that you know they don't have consent to circulate, and you are safe to say something, then please say something, right? Like, we want to be active bystanders. We want to look out for each other. If someone sends you a photo, or let me put it, if someone sends me a photo, right, of someone else, and I don't know if they have that person's consent, I'm going to ask, right? Like, whoa, are you sure that that person's okay with that? How do you know, right? Or like, that's not really okay to share. So we want to make sure we're letting people know or helping people think through like what's okay. And I would also, of course, want to tell the person I knew who was in that photo, right? Like, I want you to know that this is happening. Like, what would feel most supportive to you to do right now, right? Like, how can I help you think through, yeah, what would be useful? And like, maybe that photo is circulating with their consent, right? So just, I would definitely want to check in with that person and see what they need.
Absolutely. And I'd love to hear, Eva, what you have to say.
Yeah. So when it comes to these non-consensual images that are circulating, use your bystander intervention. Oftentimes, either A, we know who's circulating the images because it's attached to their profile or from their phone number. But a majority of cases across the world, we don't know who's circulating these images, especially when it comes to a new form of sexualized images like deep fakes that are being sent around. And that adds another layer of anonymity to the perpetrator. The best thing that we've been seeing on social media in particular is reporting it to the provider. Now, deep fakes can get a little bit tricky, but sexual images are usually against the standards of almost all of our social media platforms. And if you report it, they can work on taking it down. You should also let the person who's having their image circulated know and offer them support. Support is not going to be, don't send these images anymore, or don't be online, you should delete your profiles, because that's then victim blaming the person who's receiving the harm. Instead, offer what type of help they want, and whether that's for victims of online abuse or victims in some other person-to-person real life situations, you should always be letting them take control of the narrative that they want to have. And I think that goes into what Izzy was also saying, is maybe they did share consent, they wanted it to circulate, but make sure that you save it. Sometimes that's another thing, is once you report it, and if they do take it down and it gets reposted again, you want to have records, especially if someone is circulating a picture of your friend. Send them those records to help them if they do wish to pursue an investigation. But the reporting is super duper important to get that taken down initially.
It makes me think of when people say, the internet is forever. And I'm like, that's true, but you're still victim blaming, right? You're still victim blaming someone. The internet is forever. I'm sure there are tweets I did in 2009 that I would not send today. That doesn't mean that I can be, victimized and abused based on things because the internet is forever, right? So I think about, how you said saving things. I think it is important to save records, but I also think it's important to remember it could be extremely traumatizing if I say, hey, found this picture of you and sent it to my friend with the picture, right? Like, it might send them a message or reach out to them and say, hey, I saw this, image of you, this kind of, sexual image of you. I'm wondering if this is, something that is out there or something you want out there. And they may not want you to share it with them, right? They may not want to see it. So we want to keep records, but we also want to make sure that we acknowledge when we're asking them, what kind of support do you need? Maybe they never want to see that image because it is just so upsetting to them. And so like really asking people what they need is going to be the most, and like both of you said, is going to be the most important thing to helping someone who has experienced such a violation.
Absolutely. I think we also talk a lot about bystander intervention in IRL, in real life, with many different programs that we have across the nation. And I was taught to use like the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. And one of those was document. And if you're documenting something in real life, whether that be harassment or violence, what we always say is document it, but make sure you go up to the person afterwards who was experiencing that harm and see if they even want it. And beyond that, don't share it with other people if that person doesn't want it themselves. It's not up to you to disseminate this information. You're there just to provide support for the person that's experiencing harm. And that could happen in a variety of different ways.
Absolutely. No, I think that those are all good points. Izzy, did you have some?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit to what you were saying about the internet is forever and how that gets used in this really victim blaming way. And I just think sometimes when I hear the discourse about sexting, there's just this underlying assumption that like, well, we just can't hold people accountable, right? Like there's no accountability on the internet. So it's up to you, right? Like if your photo gets shared, that's on you because we can't expect other people to be respectful. And that is just such a fundamental problem with our culture, is that we're not putting accountability in the right places, right? Like we can hold people accountable. We are capable of that. People are capable of behaving respectfully even behind a screen. Yes, I know there's a lot of bad behavior, but that doesn't mean like, well, then it's just inevitable and like anyone who shares their photos is just dumb, right? Which is really sometimes the narrative that we hear. So just want to like really emphasize that anyone who is violating consent, they're accountable for that. And that's actually, it's actually on them, not on the person who trusted them, right? Because we're all allowed to trust people. It's beautiful to trust people. It's great to express ourselves sexually. It's great to experiment through sexting and play with photos and do whatever we want to do to express ourselves authentically, right? And it's never the person's fault who did that and like put their trust in someone if that person proves to be untrustworthy.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that and say the reality is that online sexual abuse is influenced by the same attitudes and beliefs that lead to sexual violence that's committed in person. And that shared risk factors like social norms that condone violence, harmful ideas about masculinity and femininity, and the overall devaluation of women, LGBTQ plus individuals, people of color, people with disabilities, and other marginalized communities. Like a safe space online is something that is one that's inclusive and where everyone is able to be treated with dignity and respect. If we expect that in our day-to-day personal interactions, why would it be different online? That same respect and dignity should be afforded to anyone, and we shouldn't be telling people to limit their personality and their sexuality just because it's an online space. If we wouldn't do that in person, why would we do it online?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you both. That was a really great conversation around that, and it actually is going to lead into our next questions. I do see that we have some comments, so I just want to look at the chat. Yes, someone said it seems that we recognize abuse is usually happening to women. What about males? And why are males more or less likely to report? I think that's something when it comes to digital, like if we're speaking to, consent and digital sexual violence, the same stereotypes and harms that harm women also harm men and also harm non-binary folks and trans folks and everyone. Stereotypical gender roles hurts all genders, right? It is not just something, so by the stereotypes that, people deserve things that happen to them, like sexual violence, is the same stereotype that's going to contribute to males not talking about sexual violence. So we really need to, work on, when it comes to digital consent, the fact that every person deserves pleasure in the way they want pleasure and to express themselves sexually if they want to do that. But everyone also deserves the same support and care and the same calling out if they've committed an act of sexual violence, right? We know all genders can be victimized and all genders can, victimize others. So knowing that the same things that are harming men are also harming women, I think is a really important thing when it comes to digital consent. Yes, and non-binary folks, absolutely. We're
I'd
gonna
like to add on to
Yeah,
that
go ahead.
actually, and just say, I know when we teach even in women's and gender and sexuality studies, and we talk about the patriarchy and patriarchal norms, those harms in that thought process that devalues certain gendered aspects and puts gender norms onto other people is ultimately harmful to everyone. I mean, I've seen breakthroughs in some of my male identifying students with, oh, this is actually an everyone problem, not just a women's problem. And we see that whether that be with emotions, sexuality, and oftentimes when I work with male identifying survivors, especially, it's that, well, everyone's saying that I should be flattered. That if, especially if we're playing to the sexualized I and that gaze of sexualization, and you should want to be someone that people see as a sexualized individual and is wanted, then you should be flattered, even though that abuse and harm is still happening. And
Mhm.
it's that mindset of it's not just a problem for one person, but these negatory, negative, and norms that condone violence and traditional ideas are ultimately going to continue to hurt all of us until we start to break down those stereotypes. And when I work with non-binary survivors or trans survivors, it's that, again, sexualization against one's consent. And it's the you should be flattered that someone wants you instead of I'm so sorry that this happened to you against your will or against your consent. Everyone has that right to feel free and able to do what they wish to do with their bodies and their lives. And it's where do we draw that line of condoning versus calling it out?
Mhm. Izzy, I want to let you
Yeah.
speak to that.
Yeah, I just appreciate this question, and I think we can talk about exactly what y'all are saying about how like all people can be violated and all people can be violators, and like that is regardless of gender. And also there are gendered patterns and gendered scripts that teach us to behave in certain ways, right? That are really damaging. So exactly the script you're talking about of like, well, men always want sex, right? So everything is consensual because men always want sex, right? Which is, of course, totally a lie, very violent. And like also the myth of like,
Oh,
well,
you're leaving? Okay.
also the myth that it's women's job, right, to say no, to fend off advances. So like men ask, women respond, right? That's another gendered script. Non-binary people, of course, are not even like present in these scripts, are totally erased by these scripts. So all of that contributes to the way that sexual violence plays out in gendered ways, but that doesn't mean that one gender is survivors and one gender is perpetrators. Like, of course, that's not the case. And I just think that in this particular sphere of digital sexuality, I think dick pics are like a really important example of what we're talking about here. You were saying before, there's some photos, I think it's very normalized to get a dick pic and show it to all your friends because it seems less somehow like intimate or personal than maybe when non-men share naked pictures. Somehow we have this understanding of like, oh, we protect naked pictures of people who don't have penises, but somehow like a penis picture is just funny and you share it with everybody, right? And that is, of course, still requires consent, right? Anything that's part of someone's body requires consent.
Mhm. Absolutely. And we're going to get to the next questions here because there's a lot of really good questions in here. I will say here at PAVE, and I know with the other folks here, see a lot of, we use a non-gendered language when we speak. So we are not going to say, this is unless we're talking a statistic that is based on, a group of women that were studied or a group of men, we are not going to use gendered language in that way. So yes, all survivors deserve support. So I'm going to step away from the chat for a moment and go to the next question. Covered it a little bit, but why do we think survivors of digital sexual violence experience a high rate of victim blaming? And how can we combat this victim blaming? Izzy, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think we've talked a little bit about why there's such a high level of victim blaming. I do think the internet is just treated very differently than other interactions. And then also there's a high level of victim blaming in general, right? I think that victim blaming is often, especially when it's from other people who are at high risks of experiencing violence, I think it's often a way of giving ourselves a sense of psychological safety, right? It's like victim blaming can be a way of saying, well, if I will never experience that, right? Because I'm smarter than that. I'm smart enough to not share my photos. I'm vigilant. I will never experience harm, which means you must have made a mistake, right? And that's a way of making us feel in control of our safety when like violation is not within our control, right? When someone violates us, like that's because of what they did and we can't control other people's behavior. So I do think there's a tendency and a temptation, which I really empathize with, to say like, well, that could never happen to me, so there must be something wrong with them. So I think we need to really be careful about that and step away from that and understand that violation is always the fault of the perpetrator and not of the person who was violated. And I think in terms of how we lessen the victim blaming, I think we need to, and this is one of my just like big passions in general, we need to make sure that we're talking about consent, not just about sex, right? Consent is an aspect of every single part of life from birth till death, right? We do consent education with preschoolers and with toddlers, and people sometimes are like, well, what? How can you do consent education with 4-year-olds, right? It's like, that's exactly the age that they're learning how to treat people, how to respect people, how to share, how to play, right? Like all sorts of social norms. Why wouldn't consent be part of that conversation? And I think when we build consent into all of our aspects of daily life, we don't need to do as much mental gymnastics about like, well, why is this, how is this the same as sexual violence, right? It's like, well, it doesn't matter. This is someone's body and everyone has autonomy over their own body. We don't share photos naked or not without someone's consent. We don't take photos naked or not without someone's consent, right? We just don't engage with people's bodies without their consent. And I think if that was just a more broadly understood concept from a younger age and in all areas of life, that would really be supportive.
Absolutely. I know someone who's a preschool teacher and they say they spend all day just teaching about boundaries and teaching like, when it's okay to, ask question like, if you can borrow someone's crayon, like ask them if you can don't take the crayon. Those are the foundations of what leads to like sexual consent, as you get older. And I think about like when it comes to digital sexual violence, the internet, I mean, I remember the day we learned the internet in school. Like the internet has not been around for as long as, you know, obvious like physical sexual violence has been around, right? Like forever. It's been a little less than 30 years that everyone's had access to the internet, like just in everyone's homes. We didn't learn this level of, a lot of us didn't learn this consent when we were very young, or it's just starting. So it's not just, like consent in your whole life, but like digital consent in your whole life, right? And like understanding that, someone taking things, from you when you're a kid should translate to, online spaces. But we actually need to talk to the little kids about the online spaces. And it doesn't have to be about sex, right? It could be about anything. So I think that it's the newness of the internet I mean, I know it's been around for most people who are probably here his entire lives, but the education around it has not. Eva.
Yeah. So when I am often in these spaces, I think consent, boundaries, and healthy relationships all go hand in hand, and oftentimes in the same like training and workshop. And we're always having students who are like, okay, well, what type of relationship are we talking about here? Because their mind automatically goes to that romantic or sexual relationship. But we're also focusing on those friendships and those professional relationships and that type of consent that we want to apply, like what Izzy said, to our sexual and relationships needs to apply to our everyday lives as well. And when it comes to why victims of and survivors of digital sexual violence experience higher rates of victim blaming, I think we often see not only the gender stereotypes and the overall victim blaming culture, but that perceived publicness of online spaces. The just a joke mentality, where online spaces tend to normalize casual sexual comments and jokes. We see that a lot with some of our dating apps as well, where there's this perceived okayness to a sexual joke or to sexual innuendos. And additionally, that lack of understanding about digital consent that you were talking about, Ashley, many people just don't fully grasp the concept of online consent, which then leads to those misinterpretations and oftentimes people justifying their harmful actions because of these other factors. And when we have victims and survivors of these online sexual harms, they might be more hesitant to report digital sexual violence due to that fear of being judged or shamed by their peers, by their family members. And when we try to combat digital sexual violence and victim blaming in general, it's those education and awareness campaigns that I think PAVE does a great job about as well. Supporting the reporting mechanisms, challenging harmful narratives, empowering survivors to speak out, and holding perpetrators accountable for their actions. Online spaces tends to give us a freedom to not have to deal with our own actions. And we have this big campaign that went around across multiple nations for online bullying. And now we need to apply those same standards to online sexual bullying or sexual misconduct as well.
Mhm. I think about in terms of like victim blaming, a lot of people plead ignorance, right? Like, well, I didn't know. And it's when we have bases of consent in education, in child rearing, all of these things, there is no ignorance when you understand that consent is about everything, right? And like ignorance is not an excuse for committing an act of sexual violence, but it really is that we've accepted as a society in so many ways non-consensual things. I think about all of those videos you see online where someone is like recording someone else, doing something weird on an airplane, or like, doing something in public, or even like, wow, look at how amazing this person looks. And it's like a video that's being shared without that person's consent. And it's so normalized, right? And like, even like the memification, like a tournament, these people have been turned into memes, and shared. You need to get consent for all of those things. And getting consent because you really like someone's, outfit and you're like, hey, can I take a picture of your outfit? I really like it, is going to contribute to people, asking and not sharing non-consensual stuff sexually. Any other thoughts on that question? I'm looking at the chat. Yeah, people talking about AI, deep fakes. That is a whole other panel that we can do. And yeah, the memification is prevalent, right? And we don't often know where things came from that we've been looking at, for 20 years. I think of that, the historical picture of the person at the end of World War II. That is the male soldier kissing that female nurse, and she's kind of tipped over. And then, they talk to her years later and she did not consent to that, and it's used as this like beautiful picture of like America and like, freedom. It's literally a picture of someone's freedom being taken away in that moment. So like really kind of having these deeper conversations. So we'll go to the next question. What is an unsolicited sexual image? I know we've talked a little about this. And why is an important part of the conversation around digital consent? And I'll start with you, Eva.
Yeah, so an unsolicited digital image is a sexual image that is sent to another person without the consent. So no, it's not that someone is taking a picture and sending it to someone else and someone is sharing that picture without their consent, but it's that the person receiving the image did not give consent to receiving that image. And I think our common term for it, especially with students, when we talk to them about unconsensual digital images that are like that, we think of dick pics. And we tend to not think about other body parts or other sexualized images that are also sent to people without their consent. So I'm pulling up the thing here as I started talking. So those unsolicited sexual images are an important part of digital consent because consent has to go both ways. It's a conversation, and that's the biggest part about consent is that ongoing communicative conversation. If one person is giving consent and the other person is not to whatever you're doing, whether that be online or in person, it needs to go both ways. It needs to be that informed language that's specific to what you're doing and happens on both levels. So I'd be interested to hear what you guys have to say about maybe some of the things that you've seen as it pertains to unconsensual images.
Izzy.
Yeah, I think again, right, like I have this desire to relate this back to outside of online life, right? Which is like if someone is going to get naked around me, I'd like them to ask me first, right? Not just in a sexual space. Like when I'm going to change my clothes and a friend's in the room, I'm like, "Hey, cool if I change here? Would you rather me go in the bathroom?" Right? Like I just check in with people before I get naked. I think that's like a pretty normal thing to do. So yeah, I think sometimes there's a tendency to be like, well, it's my body. Why can't I send a photo of my own body? Right? It's like, okay, well, I'm so glad you're loving your body right now. I'm so glad you're enjoying taking photos of yourself, but you still only want to share them with people who actually want to see them, right? And who are comfortable seeing you naked. And I think that's just, again, a good general practice, right? Like there's, we talk about like bystander consent sometimes, right? It's like even if the two people involved in whatever sexual act are both comfortable, don't do it in front of a roommate, right? If they didn't consent. Like we get to consent to not just what happens to our own body, but what we see, what we witness. And that's just part of boundaries and privacy. And so I think it fits right into a concept we all really understand in person. It's gotten a little bit detached. But yeah, I think we all get consent over what happens to our own body and also other people's bodies that are in front of us and around us.
Absolutely. And it makes me think of that perfect example you had of like, hey, like the roommate's in the room too, you need to ask a question. It makes me think of like there are spaces where open sexuality from everyone in the room or everyone in the digital space is embraced, right? This is not consent is never ever a conversation that is anti-sex work, anti, like consensual sexting, consensual like engaging in pornography and things like that. And I fear that like, sometimes we're no one's going that far, right? Like, and I know people are talking about it in the chat a little bit, like OnlyFans as a consensual thing that you want to engage with. That's actually a really, you know, people having to pay or having that wall between, hey, I'm not engaging in anything with, someone sexually to now I am is such a good example of consent because you are actively going into it, right? And if you go in there and you don't like it, you can leave, right? So all of these like ways that digital, like the online world has actually made certain spaces even more consent friendly is something I think about a lot because people use non like the quote unquote dick pic or unsolicited sexual image as a means to make other people feel uncomfortable. It's not just an act of like, hey, look at this picture of my like naked body because I want you to like me. It could also be, I know this makes you uncomfortable and I'm using this as a way to have a little bit of power and control over you. And I know that you might be at work right now and you're going to open this and it could cause a problem for you being in your workspace. Or I'm going to send this to your work email, right? And you're going to get in trouble for having naked things in your work email. Like it's not, like I said, it's not always with that intent of sexuality or sexual pleasure. It can very intentionally be used to cause harm when it's an image of the person sharing like their own image. It's not even an image of you, but they're using their own body to cause you harm. And I think that's an important thing to discuss too when we're talking about unsolicited images.
Yeah, I mean, those explicit content, if someone's forced to view that explicit content that they don't choose to see, it often causes the same discomfort, distress, and potentially it can constitute a sexual harassment and abuse to that person. Izzy, you made me giggle when you talked about changing and becoming naked in front of your roommate. I had something similar happen to me when I was an undergrad with one of my roommates, and I remember just thinking, what is going on here? I didn't know where to look. And it's not that I do this type of work, and I love the feminist viewpoint of sex work is work and how sexuality is so empowering, because for decades we have been taught that sexuality is something that needs to be kept private. But it's when we make our private lives public matters, that's how we get this transformation movement. So learning how to have those conversations about personal boundaries and privacy, while not saying that anyone's expression of themselves is wrong or bad, but that everyone has that right to choose what they want to do with their own bodies. And I love the OnlyFans and the sex work example, especially when we talk about not only in the US, but on that national level. How do we apply these things to other discourses? Because it does apply to all different levels of study and areas of careers. It just depends on how we change that conversation and use that modality.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. This has been such a good conversation here. And there's such a conversation going on in the chat right now. And I know like about like adults versus teens versus, like, and I wish we had more time to get to it. I have a quick final question for both of you. And it's just, if you could sum up in one sentence, something you could say to someone who is experiencing harm in the digital world, what would it be? And Izzy, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I would just always start with, it's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong by sharing that photo that's now being circulated without your consent, right? Like, you didn't do anything wrong. It's not your fault. I'm so sorry someone else did this. I'm sorry that we don't have good structures in place to make it easy to rectify or support you, but you deserve all of the healing and space in the world that like anyone would need when being violated, right? Like, this is a valid thing to feel upset about, and it's valid to need space to heal and support. So that's, yeah, my immediate thought.
Awesome. Thank you. Eva?
I'd like to echo a lot of what Izzy said. I think we as advocates tend to say the same things because they are so important for survivors and victims to hear. And it's that, I'm so sorry this happened to you. How can I support you? And what would you like?
Mhm.
And especially, I work in a small town, and small towns tend to have less resources to hold perpetrators accountable. So coming up with those intermediary resolutions to support them as they need fit, as they see fit. And that's not pushing them to seek justice. That's not pushing them to seek assistance, but allowing them to make that decision for themselves. And when they're ready, to start healing from that.
Absolutely. And I'll sort of finish it off with saying exactly what you all said. It's not your fault. And also, you're not alone. It's actually, there's a lot of people who've been through what you've been through, and there is no right or wrong way to respond, like emotionally, like to someone violating you that way. So I want to thank you both so much for this conversation. It's been wonderful. You're both just incredible advocates, and we are so lucky to have you here. So thank you. We're gonna have a break here in a moment, but first we're gonna share some resources. Gonna put them in the chat. Here's a few things for folks. One is Take It Down. It is through NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, for images of folks that are under 18. If you go to Take It Down's website, they will have, and I'll put it here in the chat, a place where you can actually submit, and you're not even submitting the full image, you're submitting like the metadata of the image to have it taken down. There is stopncii.org, which is for images of people that are 18 plus. And then there's the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, CCRI, where you can find laws in your state, and they have an image abuse hotline that is here. So I'm going to share these things here in the chat as well. And we're going to take a brief 5-minute break before the next panel. Let me put this in the chat to everyone.
And I'd like to add, if anyone is watching and would like to have more information and education, whether that be to their organizations or to the students that they work with, reach out to NTAB. It's an amazing organization that specifically does education about digital sexual violence and consent. So that's
You want
another
to,
organization you can
if
reach
you want
out
to
to.
put it in the chat, that would be great.
I will find it and put it in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Or you can send it to me and I can put it in the chat. So like I said, we're going to take a quick break. Feel free to use the restroom, grab a snack, take a stretch. In the meantime, we're going to take a look at the things PAVE has coming up. So our next panel, everyone, is going to be a conversation on bystander intervention. That came up a little bit in our first panel, so I think it is a good transition here. But this is going to be particularly within the context of the party environment. So we're going to meet our panelists. We'll start with Ali Jarocki. Ali is a
Jiraki. Very
Jarocki.
close.
Sorry, Ali Jarocki.
No worries.
Ali is a primary preventionist who specializes in bystander intervention, DEI, and public health theories of behavior. Ali received her MSPH from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and is a master level certified health education specialist. She has done violence prevention work in nonprofit, higher education, and corporate settings. Ali currently lives in California, designing accessible, meaningful learning content, often with one of her dogs in her lap. And my dog is right next to me. Nice to have you here, Ali. Next, we have Gabrielle Mejia. And I know you prefer to go by Gabby. So Gabby is a storyteller and movement builder, passionate about guiding people to find empowerment and healing in the face of hate and harassment. She holds the role of movement building and communications manager and is an experienced training facilitator and communication strategist, and has trained hundreds of people in person and virtually on bystander intervention methodologies. Gabby graduated from Fordham University Lincoln Center with a BA focused on Latin American studies and international studies. Welcome, Gabby. And I don't think Laura's here yet, but we have Dr. Laura Salazar. Hopefully I know she's in Georgia, so I don't know if there's an impact of the hurricane that's going around and if she has any issues with getting here. She's a distinguished professor at Georgia State University School of Public Health. Her research focuses on sexual violence prevention on college campuses. She's a prolific scholar with 150 plus publications and 5 textbooks. Trained as a behavioral scientist, she has extensive experience in health promotion using web-based technology and education entertainment media. Dr. Salazar led 2 randomized clinical trials demonstrating effectiveness of her program, Real Consent, in reducing sexual violence among college students. And there she is. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
I need to change my name. Sorry.
Yes, and here everyone, she's here. This is Alice. She's going to be my sidekick right now. We'll go to the first question of this panel. All right. How can party culture make it harder to be an active bystander? And I will start with you, Ali.
Great. Yeah, so party culture is especially challenging because, I mean, first of all, party culture can mean so many different things, right? Depending on the size of the university that you're at. Are we talking about frat parties? Are we talking about house parties? Are we talking about the dorm 2 doors down, right? Like those are all very different environments. But I think there's this whole idea with party culture of like, it's supposed to be chill, right? Like you're supposed to be fine. Like don't wreck the party. The big party foul is to drop your cup, right? So like, even though we know that like the big party foul should be, right, sexual harassment, sexual assault, those are much worse crimes. Often we think in the context of a party, you don't want to be the downer. You don't want to ruin things. And so, but we know that, right, bystander intervention doesn't have to be that like intense upfront confrontation. It can be, that can be really valuable, but there's also a lot of other ways, you know, when we're thinking about our 4 or 5 Ds: direct, distract, delegate, delay. Those are, you have a lot of other options in those moments with party culture. So I think that's one of the key things to remember. But as soon as we're involving alcohol, we're involving a lot of people, we're involving potentially people we don't know well. You're thinking back to my first couple of weeks, I went to UW-Madison, which is a big party school, very much known for its party culture. And as a freshman, it was really normal to be like, okay, the 4 of us from our dorm who don't really know each other, let's go wander until we find a party to go to. And it's like, you don't know the host, you don't really know the people that you're with. And so that becomes a little safer every year as you know the people a little bit better. But it's definitely a high risk to environment to begin with. And then some pressure around not ruining the vibe too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Gabby.
I think I definitely want to echo what Ali's saying around being in an environment like party culture where folks are maybe taking a step back from acting because they know that there's other people there and they want to maybe fit in. That can definitely be a factor that stops people from intervening. But what I would like to challenge folks to think about is this idea of being in a crowd can also be an opportunity that makes bystander intervention maybe safer to do or more accessible for different folks. For like Ali mentioned, for example, bystander intervention doesn't need to be a direct call out. It can be just being in community with the person that is being harmed or targeted, and then suddenly they're not alone. They're not an easy target if you just are in community with them, asking them, you know, what's your major? Or any other of those questions that we're always asking each other. So that's what I would challenge you. I know that the bystander effect that many of us are familiar with happens when we're in a crowd of folks and we're waiting for someone else to do the right thing, to step in. But we can be that person that steps in, that first person. We don't have to make sure everything is perfect and de-escalate everything and do everything, because the opportunity of being in a crowd is that we can just be that catalyst for other people that notice something wrong to also step in and to also say something. So there can be a lot of like-minded folks around us. We can just enter into like that frozen state of deer in headlights, but it's an opportunity as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And Laura.
Yeah, I think, in terms of party culture, the main issue that I see, I mean, all the issues are important surrounding party culture, but alcohol. And we know from the literature that alcohol use typically in sexual violence incidents is very prominent, like used by the victim, used by the perpetrator, and used by bystanders. So interestingly, from the work I do, I try to teach young people that even though you are drinking, you can still do something. And we teach them what they can do, like how to use that liquid courage. And we also teach them before you go out, before you're going to go to a house party or wherever the party is or a bar, even while you're drinking, it's important to take notice of your surroundings and have somebody who's going to be the babysitter. And we did get funded to do new content related to this, to teach college students how to use that liquid courage. And we even talked about like the 4 drunken Ds and gave scenarios and ways of intervening even when you've had a couple. And it actually was really well responded. And I think the whole idea behind it, though, is it was based on, which I think is kind of funny, this neurobiological research that if you can have cues and things you want the students to do in your intervention to become automatized, then it's easier for them when they are drinking to even act and do it. So I think, with party culture, because alcohol is there and it's ubiquitous and it does interfere typically with people stepping up and stepping in, we have to really teach some of the students that it doesn't matter. You still can do it. This is how you do it.
Oh, I think you froze for a second there, Laura.
You can be successful.
You're back. We have
Did I
multiple.
freeze?
You're back though. We have multiple people
Oh.
asking you what the 4 drunken Ds are. So, what are the 4 drunken Ds?
Well, it's the same. It's
Okay.
just, the same: direct, delay, delegate, and distract, but you can still do them when you're drunk. And so we kind of show people, we have like 2 health educators who show when they're drinking exactly how you still can do a direct intervention or a delegate. especially like if you're at a house party or at a bar, it's, even if you're drinking, it's just pay attention to your surroundings, but then maybe get the bartender or a bouncer to help with the situation that you notice.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. I mean, both. Thank you, all three of you, so much. We have lots of interest in this, coming up in the chat. And I think that there is a missing conversation a lot when we talk about this topic, when people kind of avoid talking about the alcohol. They say, like, don't drink or avoid drinking. And that can be good for some people, but you're really kind of missing the picture of the greater sort of reality that's happening. So our next question is, what are some ways we can intervene if we see something we believe is wrong happen at a party? And I will start with you, Gabby.
So I will just quickly go over the 5Ds because that is at the heart of my answer to this question, if it's helpful, and then I'll obviously create space for Laura and Allie to add on after me. But I work with an organization called Right to Be, and the 5Ds are essential to how we ask folks to respond in support of others when they're experiencing harm or when you see something wrong. And why bystander intervention should have all of these different avenues, at least these 5 options, in our opinion, is because we all experience the world in different ways. We all hold different identities that maybe stop us from doing something in the room or allow us to step in and use certain privileges that we hold to make sure that we can address things directly. So we're not all gonna intervene in the same way, and that's okay because we can still be supportive to that person that is being targeted. So I'll start off with distract, which is one of the 4Ds. The first one that we like to say them in order because this one feels really doable for a lot of folks. And it is just creating a distraction, a very creative, I'll give you some examples of how creative people get, that brings an end to what's going wrong without necessarily addressing it directly. And this can be going up to that person that is being targeted and asking them, hey, can you help me out? I need to go home and I don't know how to get there. Just directions in general, or pretending you know them, or creating just a distraction that is going to give them a chance to step away from that situation. Delegate is the next D, and that is intervening with the help of someone else. Often we think of authority figures, but that's not the only option we have. The person right next to us can also see that something is wrong, probably, and they can help us intervene in that moment, or they can address it directly, depending on how comfortable they are. Documenting a situation can maybe seem a little difficult in the situation where you're in a party, but I want you to keep in mind that your account of events, you're witnessing this, can be enough. You can just write down the notes of what you were seeing, who was involved, and offer that always to the person that was harmed, because you can offer that documentation to that person that is being targeted or harmed, and that will put the power back in their hands. Make sure they can decide what is done with that, instead of maybe, an instinct to maybe spread it on social media should not be directly followed. We should allow that person to decide what they put online, what they share or use to report. Then delay is the D that you do after harassment has happened, or hate, or an attempt at something wrong. And it is checking out the person and making sure they're okay, that they know that what happened to them is not acceptable, and that there's people in their community who see them and are there for them. And then direct is directly setting a boundary. So I will share that I think the 5Ds can be adapted to so many different situations. But what I think is important is that often our minds go blank during those moments. And I've been there, so I'm not saying that this is like the worst response. What I hope is that by learning about the 5Ds, maybe after this panel, you can get trained with the 5Ds. There's a lot of resources, at least on Right to Be's website. You can have that pop into your head in those moments, any of those Ds that feel like they're the right response for you and how you navigate the world. So I think whatever is going to work for you in the future or has worked for you in the past keep that in mind, keep that in your back pocket.
I think that's such a great answer. And like I think it's true of so many of these acronyms that we use, right? The consent moves, the 5Ds, they can be, you know, adjusted to fit the scenario that you're in, right? And maybe document is very little because you don't have a lot to document. And maybe you're spending more time delaying, right? Or maybe, you know, like we have, you know, not everything is so rigid. And you bring up a really good point related to the documenting, going back to our previous panel about the consent, right? You need to get that person's consent to, you know, talk to anyone else about the documentation, you know, to, you know, post or, you know, share anything, all of that, because ultimately that person has already been experienced a type of violation once. We do not want to do it again, right? By doing something they don't want. And so I think that that's a really important point. It also makes me think of how we just address trauma in general. Like you said, like some of us kind of freeze in the moment. Something that, you know, we talk about sometimes is seeing someone either maybe being hurt or about to be hurt is traumatizing. It does cause us harm. And, you know, PAVE often talks about the trauma responses, you know, the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. You can experience that in witnessing something, right? It's not just the person who's so like really having something, you know, when you're in a freeze moment or you know, you're feeling kind of unsure what to do, like the 5Ds or the 4Ds to reference is extremely helpful when you're going through a traumatizing moment. So I wanted to give you, Allie, an opportunity to answer the question, and I'll read it again. It is, what are some ways we can intervene if we see something we believe wrong happen at a party?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Gabby, for your answer. That was a really great explanation. And I also want to draw attention here to Ellie's question, because I love this question. I think it works right in of like, how do we shift the conversation from intervening to on the side of, you know, someone being assaulted versus intervening with the prevention side, preventing someone from doing harm. And I think, you know, I'll talk about that a little bit with my examples of like ways that we can intervene, because we can intervene not only, you know, with the person. We normally give our examples of like the person who's the target of harm, but all of these can be used towards the person who is instigating that harm as well. So thinking about, you know, this doesn't also, we don't need to wait until the situation is really dangerous. We don't need to wait until it's maybe an assault that's about to happen. This bystander intervention is also really valuable just around norm setting, right? Like that's not actually the like language we feel cool about in this house. And like, hey, I feel like you're a little close, should take a step back, right? I think, you know, getting earlier in those moments can make those interventions a lot easier. But with Ellie's question, I think this is really critical because the targets absolutely go to events often with friends and with people surrounding them, but we forget that like the actors or perpetrators usually do too. And so we may have a responsibility on either side, either as a stranger, a bystander who's a stranger, potentially a bystander who's a friend. We don't want to think about ourselves as the friends of the actors or perpetrators, but there's again a spectrum of harm, and someone can be both a good friend and a perpetrator, as you know, as that is to say and to feel. So, you know, direct can be like, oh, like we're on our way to a party and you just said that like you really like want to make sure you're getting laid tonight, so you're going to be handing out drinks. Like, didn't love that. Let's check that. Let's take a step back for a second. With distract, it can be, yeah, you notice someone's dancing a little bit close. If it's a friend of yours, maybe you like bring them into a different kind of dancing. Maybe you're grabbing them like, oh my God, I lost my necklace and I need your help to find it right now. Like, help me look for this. It's from my mom. She's going to hate me. And, you know, any type of, you can pull that person away too, because that can also be empowering for the target, because then they have a choice of what they do next, right? They're out of this scary situation. Do they want to stay? Do they want to leave? Do they want to move to a different area? With delegate, maybe finding the friends of that person if it's not you. If it is you, it can be, you know, hey, let's step in, let's go get Corey. Seems like there's something going on with them. Seems like they're maybe getting a little too close to people. And again, of course, you know, I think it's way better to have the the actor or the perpetrator potentially moved from the party, removed from the space rather than the target or the victim. We always talk about like getting them home safe. And it's like, how about like we're getting that actor home safe, and like then everybody is safe from them once that person is home and away from that party. And delay and document kind of our same ones. If you noticed, maybe it's early, you in the semester, you've met this new person, you hung out with them last night, and you like were a little icked by some of the things that they did, but like you're doing your, greasy brunch the next morning, that's a great opportunity to be like, I heard you say that thing. Can you tell me more about what you meant by that? Or like, this kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Like taking those opportunities on the perpetrator side too, because that can potentially reduce even greater harm later. If we're starting with, you said this thing and that's not cool, or like you said this thing, that like sounded kind of rapey, right? Like, and intervening at that point of like early on some of those norms, attitudes, and behaviors can really change things later down the road, because you're setting up right away like, no, we're not doing that, so yeah, I really appreciate that question, Ellie, and I hope you feel like I did it some justice in my answer.
I really like that. I really love the idea of establishing norms, like just not like, I'm not saying like rules posted for a party, which, if you want to do that, you can, but like, like this, hey, in this community, like that's not something we do in this space. This is a community that supports and, is not afraid to have these conversations. But that makes me think of, before we get to the next question I have, it makes me think of the aspect of fear, in bystander intervention. What happens if I'm afraid of intervening? Like, how do I address fear, either fear from, physical, or, like verbal abuse or myself getting harmed in some way, or fear of being like ostracized? So I guess I'll start with you, Gabby.
I think what I want to say first is that well, in my experiences, it's always right to trust your instincts about the different actions that are available to you. So if there are a lot of actions that might put you in harm's way, or you feel could escalate the situation, or are just not right for where you are in that moment emotionally, trust that. Trust your gut. Your gut is what's kept you safe all of this time. So it's what you need to follow. However, when you're trusting your gut, make sure that you're examining where that fear is coming from. Is it from your physical safety, your psychological safety? And while we're addressing that, we can still move into action that is maybe less direct. All of these indirect Ds, right? To address the situation that is happening. And why I think in party culture we have, I've mentioned opportunities, is because we have other people around us who maybe are going to step in ways that we can't in that moment, because of what is true for us maybe isn't true for them. So with the folks that you have around you, check in with them. Hey, do you see what's happening over there? And ask them, how comfortable do you feel about doing this, which maybe I can't do, but you maybe are very comfortable doing. So when you're in community with others, that can definitely help in terms of keeping you safe and still allowing you the chance to be an active bystander. And then if you, just to address this idea of, if you have maybe a link to that person that is causing harm, or someone that has a link to the person that is causing harm, I want you to maybe keep in mind that that person could be called in that moment by those close to them, by the understanding of the different friendships and hierarchies that are around you in this party environment. Other people's instincts are not to ignore the situation. It could just be them in that frozen state. So that would be my answer.
Awesome. Thank you. I really appreciate appreciate you taking that, because I feel like people often are like, well, that's not something that, like, I feel like that question is often avoided. So I appreciate you answering that. And Allie, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I think the piece about, of course, always prioritize your own safety, but I really loved what Gabby said about consider where that fear is coming from and what is the kind of level of that fear. Like, don't put yourself in physical harm. I know, especially like when there's alcohol involved, situations can be a little bit volatile. There are people who are potentially more physically or verbally aggressive when there's alcohol involved. So I absolutely want to mention that like, yes, prioritize your safety, potentially use some of those other Ds. But I also want to consider when maybe our fear needs to be set aside a little bit around when it's fear of like, are people going to judge me? Are people going to think I'm weird? Like, compared to maybe the risk of what's happening in that situation, that might be worth it. Like, okay, and what if they do? Like, what if people do think I'm weird? What if people do think I'm like the,
Buzz.
bummer at the party? Like, okay, there's other parties, there's other people. And to be honest, like, if that's the reaction a group is going to have to you trying to prevent harm, that's probably not a group that you really want to be part of anyway. And that can feel really hard, especially early in a traditional undergrad career when you're 18, 19, and like it feels like fitting in with every group is going to be the most important thing. Like, absolutely. But like, it's so much better to find your people that share your beliefs about what is right and what is and is not okay than it is to necessarily fit in that situation. And like, yeah, maybe that person like looks at you really weird and like isn't really interested in hanging out with you anymore. Like, okay, but maybe these two other people are like, hey, that was awesome, thank you for doing that, let's get coffee tomorrow, right? Like, and then it's like, it can also help you find your people, because it's like, this is who I am, this is what I'm about, this is the community that I want to be a part of. And so you're helping like both build that and find that and maybe roll some of those things out. And thank you, Larissa. Fear is not the same as discomfort. Yes, absolutely. Fear for your safety, physical, psychological, emotional, identity based, right? Like all of these pieces. Fear, and that's more what I'm talking about, is like discomfort, right? Discomfort, nerves, some of that's social pressure. Thank you for that clarification. That's a great word to use.
Yeah. And I think there's like, I mean, it's almost like practice too. Like once you've done it once, it's a lot easier to do that more than once, right? And like once you've called someone out or addressed something and you've really faced that discomfort or that fear that you have, you are, well, one, you might be seen as someone who other people like expect to be that support. Like they want, like, you are that person to them. And two, like you may expect it from yourself. Right. So, Laura, I'm glad you're back. I wanted to give you the opportunity to address the question of fear. You might be frozen again, though. People being like, how do we address fear when it comes to bystander intervention? I fear you're frozen. Sorry, I know you're in Georgia and I know the weather is not great there. So we're going to move to the next question. The next question is, why is it important to ask someone, and we kind of talked a little bit about this, what they want to be done in a bystander situation? And I'm gonna start with you, Gabby.
Yeah, I think I touched on this, and I think Allie also maybe touched on this, but I want us to always remember that these moments of harm and trauma can it can feel like someone's taking power away from us. It can make us feel, when they happen to us, it can make us feel that, we don't have a lot of ways to take that power back from the person. And so maybe that's why we're looking at others for support. So that is in the role of the person experiencing the harm. When you're in the role of bystander, and say you are thinking of delegating to the police, or you are thinking of calling the police, or maybe you're in the role of bystander and have documented and are thinking of going live on Instagram or posting it on social media, whatever, maybe pictures you took or video, or just sharing your account. If you do that without consulting the person that was harmed, that can feel like you've involved a lot of other different levels of power that are also being taken away from them. So what I want to encourage folks is to give the power back to that person over this experience that happened to them, and give them the power to then report using the documentation that you created, or ask them a question: do you want me to call the police? Yes or no? It's as simple as that. I think what I find to be true is that a lot of different folks are, maybe whether or not you can see it in their identity, have different experiences and levels of comfortability with the police. And involving them could increase the trauma that they feel during the situation. It can make them feel less safe or be less safe. And that can be true regarding their, immigration status, their previous experiences within the community with police. So something to keep in mind is just check in with them. Maybe they'll really appreciate the idea and be like, yes, let's do this. Let's post it on social media or whatever you want to check in about. But maybe they'll say, hey, I want this to be solved a different way. Or I want the file of what happened to me to be private, completely private, and for no one to ever see it again. That is 100% fair.
Yeah. And I think of not, we know that depending on your, immigration status, your race, your gender, your sexuality, all of these things can be, put you not to your fault, but to society's fault, at danger and at higher risk, when it comes to like police involvement. What is the identity of the perpetrator, right? Is this a perpetrator who has fit into the quote unquote like good old boy network, and you're at certain universities where that is like, accusing that person of something or that person doing something to you, and you speaking out about it is actually going to cause you harm. Like really knowing what that person wants. Because you may say like, I want to go tell everyone. And I, as the victim survivor, could say, I appreciate you wanting to do that. I love that you want to do that, but that's just not my reality. Right. And I think it's important to recognize the reality of the situation. Laura, you're back. I want to give you the chance to answer the question of why is it important to ask someone what they want to be done, in an active bystander situation?
I think that is critical. And, everybody has different responses to the situation and their experiences. And I know in the past, sometimes, we feel like, oh, it needs to be reported, or we need to get the word out so this person can, receive some sanctions or punishment. But that's not always the wish of the person who had been victimized. And I think it's really important in what I do and my interventions is really don't assume somebody wants to spread the word and call the person out, or even have, you know, report them and have even higher level punishment involved. But I think it's important to just understand and talk to the person if they need help and encourage them to get help, but not have to pressure them to out that person or spread the word on who the perpetrator was. Because then it can, like you said, it can backfire when there's different power dynamics and different issues going on there. So, I mean, I know we all want perpetrators to be held accountable, but it really is important to respect the victim's wishes along those lines. Absolutely. Because we don't want to victimize them again. And who knows what's going to happen when you report somebody or tell somebody else, and you don't want to be responsible for that.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Allie, let me give you a chance.
Yeah, so I won't repeat what's already been said. I think that's all. Gabby and Laura did a really great job articulating this, but I would also emphasize this is a really great opportunity for distract, right? Because that can give you that opening to check in with that person. It's giving that situation a little bit of space to say like, hey, how you doing? Is there something you want me to do? Do you want me to say something? Do you want me to go grab someone? Right? Like, I think that gives you a lot of the time, it's like, well, I can't check in with them because the situation is like active and happening right now. And distract can give you that moment to check in, because they're like, it's actually like, it's cool, we're good. And then it's like, okay, great, awesome. like need it, I'm gonna go get another drink, right? And like, then everything is fine. Or maybe they do want that next step, or maybe the distraction is totally enough and that just gives them the window that they need to, get to a different area or find some space. And so I think that's a really great opportunity to not just distract and then leave it, but distract and then check in, see what that person needs, and if there's further support you can offer.
Yeah. And I think it's also really like, it's a good moment for not just you as like the person who experiences sexual violence should not be the only person who knows the resources on campus, right? So that's a great opportunity for you as a person, if you don't already know the resources, that you know them, because maybe they just want to talk to someone. Maybe they just want to get access to like, STI testing or access to other things, and you can provide them with that support, resources, without violating the level of support, exposure that they're looking for what happened to them. We need to, I think, similar to the question of prevention earlier that we were talking about, being prepared for a situation as a bystander and not just having to come up with resources after something happens to someone is a really great way to let them know that you care, and that this is a space that no one can guarantee everything is 100% safe space, but this is going to be as safe of a space as I can make it when you're with me, because I consider myself to be prepared, right? So we've got a few more minutes here in this panel. I want to ask you all just one final question. If you could give one bit of advice or one phrase to someone who is, maybe thinking about intervening in a situation, what would that be? And Laura, I'm going to start with you.
Oh gosh. One bit of advice. Well, I would say that, as long as you have to be up to speed on the different ways to intervene, and really safety first before you choose to engage in any of those types of interventions. But also, I think in addition to teaching people about the 5Ds and how to do it and safety, I think having students think in terms of developing plans ahead of time. So I think we need to match a plan building, some kind of, we call it a protocol just to be funny, like having a protocol when everybody goes out, whether it's a house party, bar, or wherever you're going, ahead of time, to see who kind of can be the babysitter, someone who is the designated non-drinker to help be the monitor when you do go out, in addition to knowing what the 4Ds are. So we really try to emphasize that, of having, a protocol with your friends, knowing that's left behind, share your location, all of that stuff. Because I think that really does pair with teaching somebody the 5Ds and how to do that. And just to add that extra level of safety in there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Allie.
Yeah, so real quick, I know Laura and I have both kind of gone between 4Ds and 5Ds. So just as an information clarifier, the traditional 4 are direct, distract, delegate, delay.
Yeah.
The 5th, as Gabby articulated, is document. And some folks use that D, some don't. I think there's a lot of situations where documenting can be really great, especially as Gabby said, to give that person the information. There's some danger with documenting that then people are like, well, I took out my phone and live streamed, I was an active bystander. It's like, maybe not so much. So yes, that is that 50. So if you've been wondering why, I've kind of been saying 4, 5 and going between those, that's why. But I think my quip that I use with bystander intervention is, it's better to do something in a situation that was nothing than to do nothing in a situation that was something, right? Like,
I like that.
if you're worried, take some type of action. It can be small. It can be, just something that's like breaking that up, offering a little bit of space in between, offering a little bit of support. It's so much better to be like, oh, actually, that was totally fine. And I like, you know, asked you about your major for no reason, right? Like the consequence of that is much smaller than getting in our head, not doing anything when someone really did need support or really need help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that that's really great. Thank you. And Gabby, I'll let you finish it off.
Yeah, I mean, I could echo here. I think I'm definitely aligned with Ali and Laura's thoughts here about doing something when a situation is just starting rather than having to de-escalate a whole instance of violence. It can be just more accessible to practice bystander intervention every time. And what I'll add is often when it's just starting or when we're just noticing something wrong happening, we're thinking, hey, I don't know everything. I don't know if they know each other. I don't know details. I don't know the backstory here. I maybe just stepped into the room and I'm noticing. But when you practice bystander intervention and use these 5Ds, because they're indirect and they're just ways to show up in support of the person being harmed, you don't need to know everything. And in those moments, and this is something I find helpful, in those moments where you really think there's a piece of information you need before you take action or say something, I encourage you to ask. Ask, hey, what's going on here? Hey, do you know her? Hey, do you know each other? Even that question can be a way to
Mhm.
deter further escalation because now you're paying attention and everyone knows that. And it's pretty still indirect. It's not directly addressing, but I will leave you with that. And I'll also say this, at Right to Be, our phrase is, we're building a world free of harassment and filled with humanity. But what we don't say often, and what I want to remind everyone, is that we're not thinking of this far off world. That world is going to be built little by little, every intervention that everyone makes. And that is what changes culture. So anytime you're practicing bystander intervention, you're working and affirming that that's the world we want. We want a world where we show up for each other. We want communities and cultures where that is the norm. So your little action can actually added to everyone's little action can make a big difference in our community.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yes. Snaps. And someone else might see you do that action, right? That person might be totally fine that you're asking, but someone else might see that. And that is incredibly powerful. So I want to thank you all for having this amazing conversation. I think it's so great. If you want to pop any of your websites or stuff into the chat, please do. We are going to take a quick 5-minute break before we get to the next panel. Again, use the restroom, grab a snack, take a stretch. But in the meantime, take a look at what else we have going on for the Shatter the Red Zone. All right, I know folks are coming back from the break, so thank you all. We are going to shift into our next panel, but I am both sad to leave you, but happy to turn it over to Angela. I'm going to quickly introduce Angela Rose. She is our founder, extraordinary woman. I introduced her a little bit at the beginning, but she is going to take over the reins of hosting. And it's been great being with you all. So take it away, Angela.
Okay, thank you so much, Ashley. We appreciate you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name, as Ashley said, I'm Angela Rose, the founder and the executive director of PAVE, Promoting Awareness, Victim Empowerment. Welcome back from the break. I know it's been so many wonderful topics have been discussed so far. And now we are turning our attention to Title IX, defining Title IX and discussing the new policy. So this is such an important topic. We have two incredible panelists today. So Helene Weiss, Helene's a partner at the Marsh Law Firm in Manhattan. She works to protect the rights of survivors of childhood sexual abuse, adult sexual abuse, campus sexual abuse, harassment, and retaliation. Helene is a former Special Victims Bureau prosecutor at the Nassau County District Attorney's Office, where she prosecuted an extensive array of criminal matters, including sexual abuse, attempted murder, domestic violence. Incredible work. She has extensive trial experience successfully litigating dozens of cases from jury selection to verdict. So thank you so much, Helene, for being here. We also have Emma Grasso. Emma Grasso Levine is the Senior Manager of the Title IX Policy and Programs at Advocates for Youth. Now, in this role, she manages Know Your Nine, a survivor and youth-led project that empowers students to end sexual violence in schools. She holds a degree in social and cultural analysis from NYU, where they focus their thesis on transformative justice and community-based solutions to gender violence. Emma has successfully trained hundreds of students on how to organize to end gender violence and create survivor-centered policy change. So we are in great company today. So thank you for being with us today. So I'm going to kick it off. My first question, Helene, what is Title IX and what does it have to do with sexual violence?
Yeah, so thank you first, Angela, for having me. So happy to be here. I wanted to let everyone know I do have a PowerPoint presentation prepared, and if I'm able to share my screen, I have a couple of slides where I explain what Title IX is, what does it have to do with sex discrimination, and then I have a case study that really covers a lot of the important topics that you all were talking about, and it also includes a really great example of bystander intervention. So thank you again, Angela, for that wonderful introduction. As Angela said, I am a partner at the Marsh Law Firm, and besides some of the work that Angela mentioned, I also work really vigorously with our Title IX team, and that means that as an attorney, I get to investigate Title IX cases when they are initially reported to a school, and I get to be involved in that process. But before we talk about all of that, I want you guys to understand what Title IX is. So Title IX is a comprehensive federal law, and it's been in place for quite a while. We're going to go through the timeline of when did Title IX get put in place, when did some changes happen, and really the history of Title IX in our country. And what it does is it seeks to prohibit sex discrimination in educational programs and activities that receive federal funding. So if you're at a public university, if you're at a public college, or if you're at a public high school or elementary school, Title IX is supposed to protect students of all ages that are attending an institution that receives any sort of federal funding. It's also supposed to ensure equal opportunities for all students, regardless of their gender. Again, this is a federal law that's put in place to protect students of all ages. This applies specifically to educational institutions. So you know, this is very specific to colleges and is one of the big things that a lot of colleges we're seeing are, you know, taking a little bit more seriously and giving some Title IX training to some of their students. Besides sex discrimination, it also covers sports, and it's also enforced by the Department of Education, the Office of Civil Rights. So the U.S. Department of Education is tasked with handling Title IX rules, Title IX regulations, and any sort of changes that we might see in these regulations. So some additional detailed protections under Title IX. It protects against sex discrimination. It's supposed to help prevent sex harassment. So Title IX requires schools to take prompt and effective action to address sexual harassment, and that includes sexual assault, it includes stalking, it includes rape, it includes any sort of sexual violence that occurs on campus. I included the equality in athletics because I think, as I'll get into, some of the common misconceptions of Title IX is that it only protects athletes. That's simply not the case. There are protections for equal opportunities in athletics to be, you know, enforced under Title IX, but really what I wanted to focus on today, obviously, is the sex discrimination and sexual harassment prevention and protection aspect of Title IX. Title IX also provides a grievance procedure so that if you happen to be a student who goes through the Title IX process, there's also a way and you don't get the result, let's say, that is a fair result or is a just result in your eyes, or maybe in the eyes of an attorney that you've hired. There are ways to seek remedies and to file lawsuits to further protect yourself against an error that was made by a university. So specifically for sexual violence on campus, Title IX requires that schools address sexual violence under Title IX. Schools are required to have policies and procedures in place that address how to report sexual assault, how to report harassment, and other sort of sexual violence involving students, faculty, and staff. This basically means that your university has to have a Title IX department. So if you are a college student and you're at a public university, you can Google right now. I went to Ithaca College, for example. So Ithaca College, Title IX, what's there? You can find a Title IX page for almost every single university in the United States. That page should include what that school's Title IX policies and procedures are, what they consider to be harassment, what they consider to be stalking. It should have comprehensive definitions of what all of these different types of sexual violence are, according to this school, according to that school. Lots of schools have different standards. They all have to fall under the federal umbrella and the branch of rules and regulations that are mandated by the federal government. But schools can get more specific than what the federal government gives, and schools are allowed to give more protections to students in place. So that federal law is really the floor. It shouldn't be the ceiling to what kind of protections are in place for students. Title IX also mandates schools to investigate and respond to reports. So that means that if a report is made, that school is under a legal obligation, not just, oh, I guess we got to do this because we've got to do this. No, you legally, as a school, have to investigate and respond to any sort of report of sexual violence. It has to be promptly, and it has to be a thorough investigation. And then that school has a responsibility to take any appropriate disciplinary action against perpetrators after an investigation or a hearing takes place. So that's sort of the investigatory phase. And like I mentioned before, I have a really fascinating case study on that involves a Title IX student that I personally helped throughout the process. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Title IX also provides support and resources for survivors. So the offices at your universities should have resources, have support networks, and there's a couple of other resources that we'll get into in just a bit. I'll do this very briefly. I don't want this to seem like a college lecture, but just so you understand how Title IX started. 1972, the Title IX of the Education Amendment was first signed into law, and this prohibited sex-based discrimination in any educational program or any activity that received financial assistance. Eventually, Title IX regulations and guidelines for schools were developed in 1979. And then we have some kind of landmark cases that come about later in the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, which I have one more slide for that too. In 1984, the Supreme Court ruled that Title IX only applied to specific programs that received federal funds, which really limited the scope. There was a time period between 79 and 84 where it was a little unclear, what schools have to comply with this. And a decision was reached that if federal funding is given to a school, right, if the government is paying that school money, then that school's got to comply with that federal regulation. There was a Supreme Court ruling in 1992 that decided that public schools, that students who attended public schools, they could recover monetary damages for violations under Title IX. So now in 92, we get this civil ability for students to file a lawsuit against a school if that school has violated Title IX. So, I mean, we're talking pretty semi-recently here, the 90s. Some people think, this is a really old law. And, of course, it was enacted in the 70s, but a lot of this stuff is still in flux, and we'll get into that. In 2020, under the previous administration, under the Trump administration, there were some really scary new Title IX regulations that Betsy DeVos put out that included a much more narrower definition of what sexual harassment is and some of the new procedures for handling complaints. And I will be frank with all of you that schools across the country and lawyers across the country are still grappling with how this is going to affect cases. Although it seems like it should be pretty clear. The way it's written is not. More to come on that soon. Here's some of the cases that I mentioned. If anyone is interested in looking into them, I'm not going to specifically go into them, but for anyone who wants to do the legal research and is really interested in learning more about these landmark Title IX cases, I'll put them right up here and, give access to anyone who wants to see this presentation later on. But I don't want to belabor that too much, because I think the most important thing that I want to discuss is this case study with my student after we've explained some of these really important protections. So the potential changes that we've seen in this 2020 revision of Title IX, let's talk about those. So I have here at the very bottom, these proposed changes to Title IX, they could have a significant impact on the ability of sexual assault survivors to access support and accountability. And ultimately, this really undermines the core purpose of the legislation. If you have friends who are like, apathetic towards the voting system and really think it doesn't affect them, well, here's a major way that it does actually affect you, and that laws are being created that affect you. And this is one of them. So what was changed in 2020? The definition of sexual harassment. So it says the current administration is like a rollover, because Betsy DeVos is still, handling some of the Department of Education stuff. Let's hope that we can change that pretty soon. However, as I said before, that narrower definition just makes it a little bit more difficult for some survivors to seek recourse. It also reduced requirements for schools to investigate some of these sexual assault claims. Obviously, we can all understand that's a huge issue. It also limits the scope of some of these Title IX incidents, these incidents of sexual harassment, to say, oh, well, if it happens off campus, maybe at a fraternity off campus, or maybe at a house off campus, guess what? Now you're not protected because you weren't on the actual school's facility. That doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense to all the lawyers I've talked to that are working on this. And quite frankly, it's just bad law. And I can guarantee you that if we get some good people in the Department of Education, that law will be changed. So that's what I'm hoping for. We have some common misconceptions about Title IX. People thinking they know what Title IX is, but maybe they really have some outdated, perceptions. So let's cover that. This is a survey of only 500 college students, and this survey was taken in 2022. But what it revealed is that about 10% of people thought that Title IX only applied to sports. Not true. We know it applies to sex discrimination, sex harassment, stalking, all that stuff that we talked about. About 15% of students surveyed thought that Title IX requires equal funding for men's and women's sports. It actually doesn't. It requires that students aren't discriminated against, but it doesn't actually delineate that funding needs to be identical. So there's a little fun fact for you. 20 students thought that Title IX had no impact on sexual assault or harassment at all. They didn't know that. So it's really great that we're doing something like this right now, so students understand what kind of protections they have really at their fingertips. And just under 10% of students thought that Title IX is outdated and no longer necessary. I'd love to have a conversation with those students, because while it might be a little outdated and while we might have some really bad law right now, it's still very needed, very necessary. And even under those 2020 bad laws, I was able to get a really amazing outcome for a survivor that you're going to hear about in just a minute. We talked about some of these, but what this means on your college campus, besides some of the details we gave before. Title IX on the campus. Comprehensive policy development. That's one thing that your campus needs to have. Robust training programs. That's something that every college student during their freshman orientation week should be getting trained on. And if you're not, that's a problem. Every college with federal funding should have dedicated Title IX coordinators. These are people who are actually running the cases, making sure investigations get made, and are overseeing some of the investigations and hearings taking place. And we also need to have proactive outreach and education. These Title IX coordinators are responsible for making sure that there is a fast and effective resolution here, as well as an effective grievance procedure. Which also means that there needs to be resources on campus for students. So CAPS, some of you may have heard of this. Does your school have CAPS? Counseling and psychological services. CAPS is the shortened version of this. This should be available to each and every student on campus with a Title IX office. There's also an Office of Student Conduct and Conflict Resolution. This is sort of like a downgraded level from Title IX, where you have an opportunity to resolve a Title IX complaint in a less formal way. And of course, the Title IX office. These are all resources that your universities have to have in place legally, federally, or else they're not complying with federal law and they can get into quite a lot of trouble. All right, let's talk about this case study. And before I get into it, I just want to take a beat and ask you, Angela, I want to make sure I'm giving Emma enough time to discuss what she's got to discuss too. So I certainly am not going to go over like the 2:15 mark, but if there's any questions now, or you want me to pause before I get into this, I'm more than happy to.
Yeah, keep going, and then we'll take some questions from the audience at the end.
Awesome. Okay, thanks so much. All right, so this case study is focused on a case that I handled in 2021, and this college student, I'll call her Jane Doe, she had just turned 18 that June. She was a freshman. She was so excited to be starting her career at college, and this assault happened during the red zone. It happened the very first weekend that she was at college. She got a little too drunk at a party with some friends. She doesn't really recall meeting this abuser at a fraternity party, but she met him. He was a junior student who was about 2 years older than her, much taller, much bigger, much more sober than her that evening. She ends up getting separated from the group. He walks her back to her dorm room where she is assaulted by him. She is sexually assaulted by him. She has lots of injuries. He ends up sort of attacking her, and obvious trigger warning to everyone who's listening. I know this can be troubling to hear. He left bite marks on her, visible but bite marks. It was quite an attack. This happened during the red zone. That's why when we talk about the red zone, this is such an important, delicate part of the year for so many reasons, because there are people on campus who are so young. An 18-year-old, being around a 21-year-old who's drinking, those are people at very different points in their life. And a lot of times these older, usually men, 99% of the time, these older men on campus will target and will victimize these younger freshmen because of their vulnerabilities. That's what we know about these types of abusers. They tend to target the vulnerable, and the vulnerable people are the ones who are new at college and don't know much about it because they're in that red zone, right? So what does this person do? What does Jane Doe do after this happens? Well, she immediately wakes up that morning and realizes something is wrong. But what she did as someone who was a survivor, a victim of assault, what this student did was so incredibly smart. And I want to explain some of the steps she took that ultimately her bravery and her smart thinking ended up saving her case. She took photographs of her injuries. She that night took a Snapchat video and was in a drunken state, sending it to her friends saying, what happened to me? She immediately discloses the following morning to her two best friends. She cries, she sees the marks on her body, and then she gets a knock at her door from two of her friends, acquaintances, two gentlemen she just met on campus who said, Jane, we saw you last night wobbling back to your dorm room. We tried shouting your name. We were really nervous for you because the guy you were with looked really old. Are you okay? We were nervous for you and we want to make sure that you're doing okay. And she basically broke down in tears and said, I'm okay, but I'm not really ready to talk about what happened. She decided to go to the hospital. She decided to get a rape kit done. She decided to disclose what happened to her parents, and she immediately involved legal representation. She called me and I got involved in the case. So what we did is we submitted a formal Title IX report to the school, basically detailing the allegations of what happened that night. And that investigation got turned into a hearing process. So after a lot of grueling back and forth. A lot of her friends were interviewed. These bystanders who saw her and who knew something was wrong and who tried to shout and say, Jane, are you okay? Jane, what are you doing? They felt so compelled the next day that they just hadn't done enough. And they said, like we had a previous presenter who said, I'd rather make something out of nothing than nothing out of something. These two young gentlemen who were only 18 years old, who were also freshmen, thought, you know what? We didn't do enough to make sure she's okay. Let's check on her. And good thing they did, because they both ended up being witnesses at the eventual hearing that helped her out. And those two brave gentlemen helped corroborated evidence that we didn't even have. They saw her stumbling. They saw her unsteady on her feet. They saw that she could barely walk to her room and that this guy was pretty sober, holding her up, in control of the situation. We also got evidence including her diary entries. She decided that the trauma was just so overwhelming that she needed to get this out. So she wrote diary entries. She didn't think they were going to be used in a Title IX case. Guess what? Those were some of our best evidence. You have no reason to fabricate this when you're just thinking train of thought out loud. And it was really upsetting to her at first to have to turn over these diary entries. Of course, I didn't force her to, but we had a long talk about how persuasive it might be to the panel on that Title IX committee making this decision. And ultimately she decided, let's do this. Let's give them my diary and show them what my state of mind was like right after this. That was extremely powerful evidence. We also had social media messages. We had text messages she sent to her friends saying, this happened to me. We had messages she sent to her sister saying, expressing her fear. Obviously, we had those wonderful bystander witnesses that I told you about. And thank goodness, eventually the school came to the right decision here. They expelled Jane Doe's rapist from campus. He is permanently expelled. He was a junior when he was expelled, so he does not get the benefit to graduate from that university. It is a permanent mark on his record that he was decided to have been found responsible for a violent sexual assault on their campus. This university immediately removed this person from their campus. He has a no contact order in place. Not only can he never see this young woman again, he can never step foot on that campus again. And this was a man who both of his parents were attorneys. So you can imagine that he had very robust legal representation, extremely robust legal representation. However, my client was so brave. She was so smart. And we had so many good people on campus that were willing to testify and do the right thing, that we were able to get a good outcome because of her quick thinking, because of her documentation of so many different things, and because of the good folks that she surrounded herself with that were willing to help. And we had a really great Title IX panel who I insisted took this seriously. I took it upon myself to really make sure that this was something that we were not messing around with. So that was, I'm going to say, one of the best moments of my life when we got the notification that this rapist was expelled. And I know I see you unmuted yourself, Angela, so I just wanted to give you the chance to comment there if you had anything to say.
I just wanted to thank you so much, Helene, for all of your work and for changing the world. I mean, this is so incredible. So I do want to hear from Emma. So was there anything else that you wanted to add on this case? I just wanted to thank you. I mean, this is just incredible. And, unfortunately, a lot of survivors don't have that end. And so I just, hope and pray that with this type of work and with your continued work that we will see more of that.
Yeah, no, that's it. I have how to address Title IX violations in schools, but we can always cover that later if we want to circle back, because I certainly want to give Emma a chance to speak. So I will stop my screen share and we'll hand it over to Emma. And if we have time at the end to discuss how you guys, if you find yourself in this situation, can actually address Title IX violations, I'm happy to just tell you that and not present. So thank you so much.
I love that. Thank you, Helene. And I really appreciate the fact that you're going to make your presentation available for our participants, because it's incredibly important. So Emma, I would love to have a dialogue with you here. So in your opinion, what's Title IX and what does it have to do with sexual violence?
Yeah, thanks, Angela. And thanks, Helene, for that really, really awesome presentation. A lot of food for thought there. And yeah, I mean, I think Helene really covered a lot of it in terms of what Title IX is and what it does. I do think one thing that I want to note, though, is that, which I think is also sometimes a common misconception, and especially all the stuff about Title IX that we're all probably seeing in the news right now in terms of there's these new rules and there's old rules and there's lawsuits that are happening about them. And something we do at Know Your Nine is try to take what can feel like a very complicated legal system when it comes to these new rules and really break it down. So students and advocates and folks who maybe don't necessarily have a law degree, which I think Helene, you did a great job in your presentation of taking it from what could be a really like legalistic process and making it understandable to someone who doesn't have a law degree like me. So yeah, I think something that it can be really confusing to track all the changes. And the funny thing is that the statute of Title IX is really only 37 words long, right? That is like the power behind Title IX is in those 37 words. But then with that, each presidential administration gets a chance to release guidance and regulations to interpret what those 37 words look like. And so when we're talking about the 2020 rule versus the rule that is actually just went into effect on August 1st from the Biden administration, that's what we're talking about. The 37 words always stay the same, but then each presidential administration is interpreting those words differently, and those interpretations can have a really massive impact for good or for bad on student civil rights, on survivors' ability to stay in school and be able to, participate in an education free from violence and harassment. And so did just want to highlight that the new rules from the Biden administration did go into effect August 1st. So for any students on the call, those are available. And at the same time, there are a lot of lawsuits that are making it very complicated. We have 26 states at this point that are under the 2020 rules, so the previous administration's rules, and then 24 states that are under the Biden rules. So would definitely encourage you, if you're like, I don't know what my school would, to go to the Department of Education's website, and they have a list of schools that are currently exempt because of some legal challenges. So it's a confusing time when it comes to Title IX right now, but I think more reason for folks to engage and understand like what Title IX can achieve, and that it's a crucial tool in our toolbox to really address sexual violence in education spaces. Yeah, so that's
Thank you, Emma. Yeah, really, really helpful. So, I mean, Helene covered a lot of the misconceptions, but is there anything else we want to speak to in terms of any common misconceptions that you've heard in your career in this?
Yeah, I think what I would add there is that I think especially in the era of Title IX that we are in now, and the way that we saw the 2020 rules from the Trump administration impact students, is it really took what I think is a really important civil rights process, right? Civil rights protections under Title IX, and the way that they interpreted the statute really turned it into much more, so for some students, into much more of a criminal, legalistic process in a way that made it much harder across the board. We heard from hundreds and hundreds of students in the last 4+ years that the Trump administration's 2020 rule has been in effect of, delayed timelines in terms of reporting and having to wait between several months to, we have one student who said that it took her entire college career to resolve her case. And, we've really heard time and time again from students that many folks report or disclose just to get access to accommodations and resources to be able to stay in school. And so, I think that is a common misconception, is that, given that we know that sometimes while the criminal legal system is like a really important tool in the toolbox too, it also sometimes cannot give survivors the justice and resources they seek. And I know Gabriella on the last panel sort of mentioned this in terms of, we know that, some folks can't rely on the police or law enforcement to be able to support them in the way that they need. And so for some folks, Title IX is actually their only option. And also they're able to get a wider range of support under Title IX than they otherwise could in like a criminal legal context. So I always want to mention that, because I think a lot of folks don't necessarily know that they can get a wide range of what we call supportive measures or accommodations, things like academic extensions or resources, free mental health support, if you're in the same dorm room or dorm, complex as someone who did harm to you, getting a housing change. I have a good friend who's a lawyer who also represents folks that really encourages folks to like dream big in terms of like what would support and justice look like for them under Title IX, and then ask their school for that when it comes to supportive measures and accommodations. So yeah, that's something else that I think is really important for folks to know, that folks don't necessarily know when they're talking about Title IX.
And just to echo what Emma said about accommodations, this is a great opportunity. In terms of Jane Doe's case, for example, the minute she filed that report with the Title IX office, the minute that report was filed and that university became aware, Jane Doe had the access to accommodations, which, as Emma said, is so important. And the accommodations Jane Doe needed, what she had to have put in place in order for her to complete her freshman year, She had to get extensions on certain tests. She had to miss certain classes for investigative processes. She had to take some mental health days off of classes. And during this process, that means the Title IX officials are going to her professors and literally telling her professors, you cannot negatively impact this student's grade because she's going through the Title IX process. So Jane Doe is protected from failing a course or from not being able to participate in a test, because once you report this and you're engaged in this extremely intensive process, you might not be able to go to all your classes. You might need a mental health break. You might have to skip a test, and the school has got to accommodate you if you request those accommodations. And that's a huge thing that we continuously needed. We also had a situation where Jane Doe was involved in a sport. She was a college athlete. And unfortunately, this abuser was also a college athlete. So after school, when they were in their practice fields, unfortunately, they crossed paths, and that was a problem. We had to get accommodations for that as well. So what Emma said about accommodations is so true, that the accommodation aspect of this cannot be emphasized enough. This is a confidential process. And so if you know someone, or you yourself, might find yourself in a situation where Title IX is an option for you, the accommodation aspect of this can be critical, and it can really save your educational career.
That's great. Thank you, Helene, for that. So Emma, kicking it back to you, what changes to Title IX do you think will have the greatest impact on sexual assault survivors?
Yeah, thanks for that, Angela. I mean, I think Helene covered some of them already in terms of some of the key changes, that the differences between the harmful parts of the Trump administration's 2020 rule versus what we've seen in the Biden administration's 2024 update, right, to Title IX. And I have a couple of like key distinctions that I think I really want to make sure that students know, because the hope is that you know about these Title IX rules and the resources and the civil rights that they provide you with before any harm happens, right? And so, something that I think we were really excited to see in the 2024 rule is this broadening of the definition of sexual harassment. So under the new rule, schools must address harassment if it's severe or pervasive, to the effect that it denies or limits someone's ability to participate in a school program or activity. And that is actually quite a bit, I know the language sounds severe, but it's actually quite a bit of a lower standard than was under the Trump rule. And we really heard from students in the last 4 years with the Trump administration's rule in place that the burden was really on students to prove that what they experienced was bad enough to warrant a response from the school. And so this change really ensures that students who experience, we know that harassment and violence can look like a lot of different things, right? There's a broad spectrum of different types of harassment and violence that students can experience, and that anybody who experiences any type of violence or harassment can receive those resources and protections from their school. So that's thing number one that I really want to make sure folks understand. And I know Helene also touched on this, but I think the on versus off campus change is also so crucial. We know that so much of harassment or violence that students experience actually doesn't occur on physical campus grounds. And so under the Trump rule, schools were not legally obligated to address any of that. And so a survivor could report and say, this thing happened to me off campus, and we heard stories of students basically being turned away from their schools, saying we don't need to address that because it didn't happen on school grounds. And so the Biden administration's rule really expands schools' requirements and makes sure that they are addressing harassment that does not just occur on school grounds, and that creates a hostile environment for a student at school, regardless of where it actually physically occurs. And then the last piece that I just would love to highlight is that I think in the Biden administration's rule, they really make it clear that schools have to take prompt and effective action, is the language that they use, to respond to harassment and other types of sexual violence or gender-based discrimination. And we did a survey, Know Your 9 did a survey a couple of years back, and found that 39% of survivors who reported violence to their schools experienced a substantial disruption in their education. And to just like paint an even clearer picture, that looks like 27% of survivors having to take a leave of absence, 20% having to transfer schools, and nearly 10% having to drop out entirely. And, these sorts of educational interruptions occur not because of the sexual violence or harassment alone, but also because of the way that schools exacerbated the harm that was done to students by not responding in an adequate way, right? And so we really know that this requirement is can make or break a student's ability to get the degree that they intended to get from the college that they want to be at, to be able to achieve their dreams educationally and academically and otherwise. And so the piece around prompt and effective action, it's going to has the ability to reduce and eliminate those really long waiting times that I mentioned earlier on Title IX processes, and also just make sure that schools are providing adequate supportive measures, accommodations, and resources to students. So that's another one that I think is really, really crucial to highlight.
That's great. Thank you so much. So Emma, last question for you, and then I'd love to hear from Helene on this. What are my options if my school is not following Title IX?
Yeah, I have sort of a two-pronged answer to this, and I'm going to put my organizer hat on, an advocate hat on, and then I'm going to put my sort of like policy wonk hat on. And I come from an organizer background, was a student organizer myself back in college, working on Title IX at my school and trying to improve it and work with my school administrators. And so something that we train students on how to organize and advocate when their school does not have necessarily, there's issues that their students are seeing between what maybe the policy says, right, in their school's written policy on their website versus what they're seeing in practice. And so, I think the first thing that I encourage students to do is like have a meeting with your administrators and see what, students totally deserve to have a place at the table when it comes to making these policy changes. And so schedule a meeting with your school administrator, say like, hey, I'm seeing these things. We really want to see these changes made. Hopefully they're receptive, but also if not, we know that sometimes folks can be scared of change or be worried about reputation or liability or other things that can sometimes be obstacles to creating that change. And so we also really encourage folks to escalate if you need to, right? We've seen students have a lot of success with getting press involved to make sure that, there's light that's being shed on what's going on at a school if a school is not responding effectively, or, build out your base and make sure that you have a bunch of allies in your corner if you're going to do a protest, things like that can be really important tactics if you're not having success sort of in those behind closed doors meetings. So that's sort of my organizer hat, is just really encouraging students to take that action. If you are seeing something that you want to see changed, you should totally feel empowered to use your voice and show your power and have a seat at the table at those meetings, and also escalate and take it outside too if you need to. I don't mean literally take it outside, I mean like use outside tactics, right? And so so that's sort of my organizer answer to that. And then in terms of policy, I actually wanted to share, we have this guide that we've developed for students and advocates, and I'll put it in the chat, about how to file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, which is something that anybody can do whenever they would like to. You don't have to be a lawyer to file a complaint. Of course, it can be helpful to have a lawyer, but it's not necessary. And that's definitely a helpful enforcement mechanism. It just makes sure that the department is aware of if there are violations happening, and then they can come in and do an investigation. And it doesn't just have to be on you as a student or as an advocate or as a community member to sort of try to hold them accountable. There's broader enforcement mechanisms that also are in place.
Very helpful. Thank you so much. I love the two different hats. That's so great. So Helene, we've got a couple more minutes if you want to answer that question and maybe share what you were going to share before. However you want to take the last couple minutes, we'd love to hear from you. What if my school isn't following these things? What can I do?
Yeah. I mean, Emma handled that perfectly. That's exactly what you should do, is use your voice, be brave, speak up, escalate. I'm just echoing what she said because that was the perfect answer. And I'll add to this. Like Emma said, you absolutely do not need a lawyer to take on the Title IX process. But if you want to seek legal advice, most attorneys will give a consultation, at least a consultation for free, absolutely free of charge. So, and a lot of attorneys, they will take this on a contingency basis, which means they don't make any money off the case. There are pro bono Title IX lawyers out there. The folks on the legal side that are working on this are generally people who, are not trying to do this because they're making a big payday. They want to help students on campus. And so we do take a lot of pro bono Title IX cases as well. I know some firms that do that, and some associations that do. So like Emma said, escalate this, be a voice for your campus and stand up for what is right. And if you feel like this is something where you want to call a lawyer up, don't be scared to look in your county, in your city, in your state, what kind of attorneys you might have access to right in your state that know Title IX protections, that might be available for a free consultation, and reach out to them.
Great. Thank you so much, Aline. That's so helpful. And just a quick mention, we've got a really active chat, and I just want to thank Mandy for sharing people with disabilities are more vulnerable to sexual assault, especially autistic people. Thank you so much for that. We've got Larissa talking about the mention of the SANE exam. I was just wondering, maybe in the Jane Doe case, did she go through the SANE examination? That could be a good resource for documentation to have in the tool belt. Was Larissa?
So yeah, she actually did go through the exam, but she hesitated a bit and she went after a shower, and unfortunately there was no recoverable evidence from the SANE exam. However, it did help corroborate that, as we know, typically people who undergo SANE exams are not doing it just for fun, right? They're doing it because something horrible happened to them. So although we were not able to get any sort of, I guess you could say, biological evidence from that, it certainly was a helpful thing that Jane Doe decided to go to a local hospital and have a SANE exam done.
That's great. And another piece in the chat that I'm so passionate about is making sure that colleges can work with local domestic violence and sexual assault agencies. Someone mentioned that we can get MOUs with our colleges, with those local agencies. So I do want to end with, this is just the beginning of this conversation. So in just under 2 weeks, on October 10th, we're going to be hosting an even more in-depth discussion with our wonderful panelist, Emma, on behalf of Know Your Nine, to highlight even more of these Title IX updates. And we're going to have some info in the chat below, so please join us for that. So thank you to both so much for your conversation today, but for all the years of work that you continue to do to change the world. We are incredibly grateful. So thank you, ladies. And we are now going to take a quick 5-minute break before we begin the next panel. So feel free, use the restroom, grab a snack, and take a stretch. You can also comment in the chat. We've got some really active chats happening, which I love, for people to be connecting. I always feel like we're stronger together, so that's always good. And we're going to hear a brief message from PAVE speaker Julie Wallach, and that's going to be highlighting PAVE Speakers Bureau. And a link to register will be, all the things are in the chat. So thank you again so much, ladies. I really appreciate your work and your words today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Julie Wallach, PAVE speaker, coach, and advocate. I hope you're enjoying today's summit and feeling inspired to create change at your college or university. You can continue to shatter the red zone after today's summit by bringing a PAVE speaker to your campus. For over 20 years, PAVE has been a premier provider of speakers, keynote presentations, and workshops on sexual assault awareness, trauma-informed response, and sexual harassment training. Featuring the nation's leading experts on sexual assault prevention and survivor empowerment, PAVE speakers take a positive and proactive approach that engage people of all identities to be part of the solution. PAVE speakers are often survivors themselves and have educated various audiences at high schools, college campuses, corporations, and conferences. Attendees include law enforcement officers, first responders, teachers, students, guidance counselors, advocates, and more. From audiences of 5 to 50,000, PAVE speakers inspire individuals and communities to end sexual violence and support survivors. You can choose from a diverse group of speakers who come to PAVE with unique stories and perspectives, including myself. I'm a speaker and coach with a commitment to helping others find their voice and move through healing from sexual violence. I've testified before the California Senate to support sexual assault survivors, including myself, and spoke out to my family when I was in college. I'm honored to work with organizations like PAVE to advocate for prevention, awareness, and large-scale change. Whether speaking on global platforms or working one-on-one, I provide tailored support, combining storytelling and healing to create lasting impact. I stand in tender solidarity with survivors wherever they are in their healing journey. Please visit shatteringthesilence.org/speakersbureau for more information and to inquire about bringing me or another one of the incredible speakers on PAVE Speakers Bureau to your community.
That was so great. Thank you so much, Julie. We've got about 2 more minutes about a minute and a half left of our break, but thank you to all of PAVE speakers across the country. We have been doing this work now for almost 25 years. And it's just been incredible to see so many people shattering the silence and really creating these positive conversations. So we've got about one more minute of our break and we'll see you right back here. And our next conversation is very powerful about rape culture. It is our final panel of our Shatter the Red Zone Summit. Before we have a wonderful closing meditation from Ashley coming up and a nice closing wrap up, but I am so excited to introduce our next panelists. We have two returning incredible speakers. So thank you all so much for being here today. First, we have Ray Epstein, pronouns she and her, a senior at Temple University, where she serves as student body president. Thank you for your student leadership, Ray. Ray is the founding president of Student Activists Against Sexual Assault and occupies the first LGBTQ plus position at It's On Us National, where she's developing programming to better represent the experiences of queer survivors. Such incredible work. She's a state director for the Every Voice Coalition and ambassador for Callisto. Welcome, Ray. Thanks so much for being here. And next, we have our wonderful returning speaker, Yvonne Ramirez de Blois, as a Latina advocate, pronouns she and her, speaker, facilitator, and executive coach who specializes in advocacy and leadership development with a focus on sexual violence prevention and gender equity. With 15 years of experience in higher education and nonprofits, she founded Elevating Authenticity to support socially driven leaders in honing their skills and creating impactful programs. Incredible work. Raised in a matriarchal household, Yvonne's passion for advocacy and gender equity continues to drive her work. Welcome back. Thank you so much for being here today. And last but certainly not least, welcoming back for our another year here, we've got Miss Bonnie Shade, pronouns she and her. She is a professional speaker and researcher focused on ending campus-based sexual violence, empowering women, and building better communities. Bonnie provides audiences with real, tangible, and interesting tactics that they can use to understand the big picture and impact in their communities. Through her exciting keynotes, workshops, and curriculum design, Bonnie focuses on education that changes the perspective of her audience members by developing an honest connection and exposing preconceived beliefs before diving into the new material. So thank you so much for being here, our wonderful panelists. So we're going to be talking about some tough subjects today that are certainly going to change the world. So my first question, and Bonnie, we'll kick it off with you. What is rape culture and what behaviors contribute to or enable it?
Great question. And I love that we're starting with this question. Thanks for having us. By the way, PAVE, Angela, we're excited to be here. So rape culture in a nutshell, right, is really focusing on those knowledge, skills, things that might happen within a culture that are co-signed around the topic of sexual violence, right? That's the way that I like to explain it. Just the co-signing of behavior that might make you go, I don't know what that is. But that sits weird with me, right? That doesn't sit right with me, but we don't say anything, we don't check it. And so we just kind of let it go by the wayside. And this is something we see in fraternity and sorority life on college campuses, athletics, many different organizations. So rape culture is one of those topics and one of those things that if we want to talk about sexual violence prevention, we can't do it without talking about rape culture.
Love that. Thank you so much, Yvonne. Let's go over to you. What's your opinion on rape culture?
So I would say, I think I would add on to it's very much like a spectrum. And so I think the same to what Bonnie said, to add on it's that environment that condones it, that co-signs, that downplays it. And so it begins with those rape jokes. It's a culture where we see, sexual conquest, but also very much the belief in the dichotomy of the traditional gender binary, right? So hyper masculinity and then hyper femininity. And when we talk a little further into sorority and fraternity life, it's really that, like with rape culture, it's that hyper masculinity, hyper femininity from sexual conquest, rape jokes. It's this environment that from the little things no one speaks up about, it's the norm, so that then we do get to the sexual violence, the sexual assault, the rape, because it starts with the little and builds up to this massive norming society that unfortunately condones this violence.
You're so right. The power of language is just like how it begins. And so, Ray, what do you have to add about rape culture?
Yeah, that was so well articulated. I don't want to sound too much like a broken record, but it really is a predominant societal attitude that is complicit in situations where jokes are coming up or implications of instances of abuse itself. It doesn't just mean abuse. Often, I think, to an outsider, rape culture is synonymous with just the term rape, and they think it means sexual violence. I know a lot of people get really clammy and frozen up when you talk about rape culture because they think it's that instance of violence, but it's everything that leads up to it and everything that allows for it to occur.
Great feedback. Thank you so much, Ray. So, Bonnie, how can rape culture show up in Greek life in both fraternities and sororities?
Absolutely. And I'm going to say one word here, homogeny, right? I think anytime we get into an echo chamber of like-minded individuals, people who oftentimes look like us, believe the same things we believe in, have similar values to who we are, I think that echo chamber creates again, co-signing, to continue using this rape culture language, right? This co-signing of beliefs and what we think is appropriate or inappropriate in the world. In fraternities and sororities, we see that happen immensely, right? Having 14 years experience working directly with fraternities and sororities, right? The number one thing that we hear from fraternities and sororities, who often are kind of looked at like, oh, what's going on with that group? What's going on with that chapter? Is oftentimes they'll get in trouble and they'll say, oh, I thought that's just how we did it, right? Or that's just what I was told to do or what I was trained on. And that's that homogenous thinking that happens from the jump. So I think when rape culture shows up specifically in fraternities and sororities, we see it play out from weeks, months, years, sometimes decades, or even, dare I say, our founding of fraternities and sororities, of what we were founded upon in those sorts of things, right? So I think the key way of the way it does show up is through that homogeny. I think a second way it shows up also is just in how we behave and how we act as fraternities members. And I say we because I'm a very proud member of my sorority. And so I am in this system as well, right? And own my part in that. And so I think it's powerful when we get to have some different conversations in the fraternity and sorority world around how rape culture does show up for us, right? Social events, access to alcohol, who has access to these social events and to this alcohol, what are the power dynamics in that environment that allows rape culture to be perpetrated in the first place, right? So I'm thinking 30,000-foot view when it comes to these fraternities and sororities, and I see my panelists also being like, okay, Bonnie, okay, because I think it's one of those things that we often don't think about. We want the tangible, nitty-gritty pieces of it, where rape culture, as it is in the majority of places in systemic oppression, right, shows up in the bigger system, and it is the exact same way in fraternities and sororities as well.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. Yvonne, how about for you? What do you know, how can rape culture show up in Greek life?
So I think Bonnie hit a really important point is like the structure and the foundation, but I would also say the policies that even govern the national councils. And so, right, I do also want to say there are culturally based organizations. And so I think traditionally when we think of Greek life, we think of NPCs. So, right, the traditionally white sororities, white fraternities, but there are those culturally based that are traditionally Black sororities, Black fraternities, Asian, Latinx. And so I think when we think about that, there is some intersectionality that goes into that. But I will say, thinking big picture, when we think about the traditional sorority, fraternity life, Southern, the TikTok Greek life recruitment, NPC does not allow alcohol in the houses. And so then it really becomes talking about power dynamics, right? Who gets to host the parties? It's the fraternity men. And as much as we want to push into doing third-party vendor events, so that means, at a bar or et cetera, an event that's not in a house, we then run into, well, the 18-year-olds can't drink. And even though it is a law, you have to be 21, it really plays into those dynamics of who has the power, the fraternity men who can have alcohol in their homes, and the sorority women who can't do that. They can't host. And so they're under a certain age, then they feel like they're tied to that. The Greek loyalty, what is the power dynamic in that? And so I will say then for the more culturally based, we really do then see it's still very much grounded in that traditional gender norming. But then we also see when we think about who tends to be punished, persecuted, which perpetrators are held accountable more, we really do fall into more people of color are held accountable. And so it really gets into the complexity of folks wanting to protect, right? So it's not always, and I don't want to fall into the binary, but Greek life is still very binary, right? They want to protect the Black men, they want to protect the Latino men, we want to protect the men in our race, our ethnicity, and right, also men can be sexually assaulted, and I think that also gets complex when it comes to reporting. But a big aspect that falls into that is the protection of our culture, the protection of our race. We don't want to continue to be perpetrated. We don't want to continue to be portrayed as a society and like our men are bad. And so I think there's that intersectionality piece that I think it's really important to think about. But it really is who holds the power and how Greek life continues to perpetuate the gender norm, since there's only a small amount of groups that actually allow non-binary folks. They're still very much grounded in the binary women, men, and that hypermasculinity, hyperfemininity, and who holds the power.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Yvonne. And Ray, how about you? Do you have anything to add in terms of how rape culture can show up in Greek life?
Yeah, absolutely. I think everyone's kind of hit the nail on the head. You have to look to the foundation of Greek life to really understand how rape culture prevails today. And like Yvonne was saying, the way that fraternities and sororities are structured, or at least in a fraternity council and Panhellenic, sometimes sororities don't even have houses on campus. For example, at Temple, where I go, sororities can't have houses. And so the only place to gather for social functions is a fraternity. And that power dynamic is embedded in that. There's no place to even escape to as a group of people where you can be alone and be women without the fraternity men existing around you. And so it's their house, it's their territory when you come in. From the moment you enter that door, somebody else has the power and you're giving it to them when you walk in. And sororities, again, like they can't have alcohol, and fraternities often can't either, but sometimes fraternities are the ones that are willing to bend the rules traditionally. And so that's a dynamic that's there. But we can also think about there's some ways that fraternities have worked to mitigate those risks because they have risk chairs, but it often still, you look to tradition and the secrecy that's a part of fraternity culture and of sorority culture as well. Tradition is so important, and it's about carrying on the founder's message and their mission, whether it's philanthropic or whether it's about the not so pretty traditions that are a secret part of those almost societies. And that secrecy and that normalizing, not talking about what's bad and what's hazing, it really creates a culture of silence and sexual violence that is unlike any other. I mean, it's very similar in athletics as well. When you think about hazing rituals and entering a team, it's a secrecy that's not normal or prevalent outside of Greek life. And so it really creates a culture of silence.
Very good answer. Thank you so much, Ray. So, Yvonne, let's go back to you for a minute. What can members of Greek life do to build a culture of consent?
Of course. And I think in some of the comments they've brought up like hazing. And I want to say I think that is right. Hazing is not just physical. I know if you're really into the hazing and into the Greek life community, and right now it's hazing prevention week in Greek life. They always say capital H, little h, right? That's how the education tends to be. And capital H tends to be that physical. We can tell from a million miles away it is hazing, and a little h is more of those traditions creeping in, traditions where people, it's the power play. And so I will say, right, I think when we see hazing, there is a lot of that. We see the sororities helping the fraternities haze the men. And we do see that power dynamic once again, like, oh, this fraternity's the best one on campus. And so now they're going to tap this sorority to help them haze. And all of a sudden the sorority's like, oh my God, we're such a big deal. And we also see like that gender binary play in because, I mean, I don't think that education should be given as a punishment, but, I did go in once to give an educational to a fraternity who had really not great, they were perpetuating a rape culture. And one of the things they did is they had a wall where the men had to put the underwear of the women they slept with on the wall, and whoever had the most underwear meant that they were like the man. And so while like talk about rape culture, because right, it's all about the sexual conquest, it was also very much what about the folks that don't have who first of all are monogamous or who have partners that are not female wearing type who may be men. And so I think that is also where we see hazing, because it is this pressure of, in order to fit in, especially for the incoming class. And I know some fraternities have tried to move away from like, oh, that pledging period where it's like 6 weeks, 8 weeks, but you're still the youngest member per se in the fraternity. So even though you may get your invite to the fraternity and then get initiated the next day, there's still that dynamic. So I wanted to say that because I saw in the comments there's been a few questions about how hazing plays into that. But I think it's the educational. And so I think, right, how do we incorporate everything's intersectional, right? And I think when we think about, Greek life always does the hazing prevention, because we always think about Greek life and hazing prevention. How are we breaking into that, the sexual objectification of folks? How are we really talking more than just capital H, as they say? But also I think it's, how do we believe survivors? How do we try to break through the group think, right? As Bonnie said, it's so homogenous sometimes where it's like, I just want to belong. And when we think about the campuses that do recruitment, right? I mean, some schools in the South, you don't even start school. You come to campus 2 weeks before classes start, get initiated, and then classes begin. And so it really becomes this Greek loyalty of, these are my only friends. I'm gonna believe the fraternity because like I know Bob, and I want to remain cool instead of like protecting my friend and believing my sister, or vice versa. And so it really becomes this like, we need to really help them think about how to break through groupthink, really help them understand what is sexual violence. I think that's a theme that we always talk about. I love that you all had a panel today about how to actually be a bystander at parties, because that's really where we see it. It's the, the jungle juice, don't know if that still exists, but right, that mixture that the fraternity makes and people don't actually know what's in it. And so they're drinking so much, and the standard beer size, et cetera, goes out the window. So how are we being there in the moment to support our friends so that a sexual assault doesn't happen? And really even thinking about, when you have a party, are you going to the traditional, hose, et cetera, those party themes that we always see, that is that perpetuation of rape culture. And so really thinking about, how do we provide that education and provide mechanisms for people to stand up and not continue it occurring.
Thank you so much. So Bonnie, what can we do to promote a culture of consent in Greek life?
I got a list, y'all. A list. It's long. Also, shout out to Yvonne for everything she just said. I was sitting here like, oh, this is, yes. So I think for me, I turn to research, right? I believe data tells a story. It informs us on many different forms. So in the research that I've done with my company, we've collected over 12,000 thoughts, opinions, biases, and beliefs from incoming fraternity and sorority members across all, predominantly it's 4 councils, right? We have NPC, which houses 26 Panhellenic sororities. We have IFC, which the number changes week to week on how many they house, but those are the oldest fraternities that exist. We have NPHC, which are home to our African American or Black American fraternities and sororities. And then we have NALFO or an MGC, which also houses some of these multicultural groups as well, right? So in those 4 councils, the research that I've done has broken down what their education level is around things like rape culture, consent education, and what is sexual violence, right? As they're coming into their fraternity or sorority. So of these 12,000 surveys, assessments that we have done, the majority of the theme with them is that they do not know what sexual violence is, right? Going back to the spectrum of sexual violence. They don't know what sexual violence is, number 1. Number 2, they don't know what the resources are to report, to move forward, to have the conversation. And number 3, they don't understand that the definition of consent changes based off of the university that you attend. And the majority of them have never had a conversation around consent, especially if you live south of the Mason-Dixon, east of the Mississippi. Like they don't have that conversation, right? So it's important that we realize one of the first steps of combating rape culture in fraternities and sororities is what higher ed practitioners have been doing since the earth has cooled, meeting them where they are and having these honest conversations, not in a way of don't rape, don't sexually assault, but like, here's what sexual violence actually is. Yes, it can be those sexist jokes. Like I can take a joke. What I can't take is disrespect disguised as a joke. It's important that we realize that the words and the language that we use mean something. There is power there. It's important that we realize when we send this picture to this sorority member that we thought was just real cute, that we didn't ask for. Y'all know the pictures I'm talking about, right? Those pictures are a problem. But also sorority members, when we show all of our sisters this photo that we just got, that is also a form of sexual violence, of exploitation, right? And so I think that education is first and foremost, it has to happen. And no, it can't be a penalty. It can't be you guys had a party that was inappropriate, you're going to have Bonnie come in and speak to your chapter. I do a lot of work with fraternity men and work with a lot of national organizations. And the work that they're doing is one of those things that they're like, you know what, we want every chapter to get this information because it's valuable and important. They are working to change the culture around what fraternity is all about, right? I think that's one. I think having been a former on-campus professional, and Yvonne, I'm sure you feel this way too, right? We don't talk to each other more. On-campus professionals need to have these conversations, these dialogues, these understandings, right? Because one thing we haven't discussed is what happens when sexual violence happens across institutions. What happens when sexual violence happens within the same organization and same gender sexual violence behavior, right? And so in those moments, it's really important that the Greek life advisor step up and know that, okay, if I work at the University of Alabama, one of the largest Greek systems in the country, and we have a football game coming up with the University of South Carolina, right? Another major SEC large public institution. Those two Greek advisors should be communicating before, during, and after the event. Because groups are going to go to each other, tailgate, party, have a good time. And what we know to be true is in fraternity and sorority life, over half of the time, these acts of sexual violence involve alcohol, right? So let's look at these high risk areas and have conversations with other people that are in our corner, understand this. So that way, when something happens at the University of Alabama, but it was one of my South Carolina students that did something, guess what? I can now hold them accountable because I've been made aware that something has happened, right? Also with the caveat, if the victim survivor chooses to report and go forward and utilize those resources, which the data tells us they don't know what the resources are. So, right, like it's a snowball effect of like what happens first. And then I think too, it starts with the national organizations. These national organizations have policies, procedures, data points that are outdated, right? I look at NPC every day and I'm like, I know you think this is helping you liability wise, but it looks crazy. It looks crazy that we cannot have alcohol in the house, that we cannot support social events in our spaces, in our places. I think it's very true, though, also for the university, right? I said this last year, universities are business makers. And it's important that they realize that when you can't have alcohol in the residence hall, students are going to turn to a place where they can have a good time, have a good social event. And oftentimes that lands in the hands of these fraternities, these IFC fraternities. Let me be very specific. So if the national organizations are working to educate to ensure some of these things are happening, it's vital that they do that education to prevent the things from happening that they know are a problem, to reduce their liability, but also just educate their people. The cause of fraternity and sorority life is to make men better men and women better women and siblings better siblings, period, the end. And sexual violence prevention is not just a skill you need in college, it's a life skill, right? Responding to victim survivors, intervening, stepping forward, this is a life skill. And so if we are here to talk about life skills in fraternity and sorority, guess what? This absolutely has a place at the table. And I think some national organizations are starting to realize that. Others are still worried about stuff we've been talking about for decades and are behind the eight ball.
Excellent. Thank you so much for all of that. So, Ray, turning it over to you. Let's talk about it. What can we do to build a culture of consent in Greek life?
I think it's really important for us to understand we're talking from an often outside perspective. Not all of us. Obviously, some people are involved in Greek life, but often organizations are coming in as outsiders trying to train and trying to educate, which is important. But I think another question that we need to kind of ask ourselves is how can we empower these communities because they are isolated, siloed communities to want to receive information, specifically fraternities, because this is not information that sororities are traditionally trying to combat. This is information that we're trying to bring into all of Greek life, but that is often not received by fraternity men. And we have to ask ourselves why. And I think one of the reasons that they're not receptive often is because we are putting them in a box, even by just saying fraternity men. They are in a box that has historically been proven to be more likely to perpetrate, but is not going to be receptive at all if we come in and we treat them as people who are more likely to perpetrate than are more likely to be victimized because men are more likely to be victimized than to perpetrate, even in fraternities. And often hazing is sexual. And so when you're speaking to fraternity men about sexual violence prevention and rape culture, and so many of these programs are so gendered and speaking about how they're supposed to stop their brothers from perpetrating against women at socials or their sorority sisters or perpetrating against women in general. those victims are isolated and their brains are going to shut off and they're not going to receive any of the information that's coming in. I'll give an example. So my student organization did a training with fraternity life the first year we were established. We didn't really know what we were doing. I had my own biases about fraternities before I really dug into that research about how they're more likely to be victimized. We did a screening of the hunting ground that was mandatory for all pledges. The hunting ground is a really powerful older documentary, also pretty gendered, about how there's a big section about fraternity men perpetrating against women. We make them watch the whole film and then we talk at them about, we have a discussion. Nobody raises their hand to participate, even though participation is mandatory. And so we have to cold call on people who don't even know what they just watched because, of course, they turn their brains off. Because why would they want to just have these random girls come in and tell them what's wrong with them and tell them that they're likely enablers of abuse? It's vilifying and it's dehumanizing in a way. And then the second time we did that training, we had all of the fraternity presidents lead the discussion instead. They had about how they can be a leader in their community. It was about empowering communities to be leaders in their own communities about standing up and being an active bystander, but about also stopping hazing that was sexual and about how men are victims too, and giving a speech at the beginning and the end that clarified and emphasized that men are likely to be victims, and that is why we're here. We're here to be a resource for you, not to tell you something's wrong with you like you might expect from one of these trainings. And so I think what really is important right now is for people who want to go in and educate to think about how they're going to be received and to make sure that they have that kind of clarification before they start speaking to fraternity men, that we're here to support you and we're here for you first, not to tell you something's wrong with you, but because education is important about the resources that are available to you as a potential victim, to equip you with resources in case your friend is victimized, to equip you with resources to stop your friends from being victimized. And I think that that's how we empower communities. In that discussion, everybody participated because their leader, the person they admire, who is a man, a fraternity man, the ideal man they want to become, was leading it instead of a bunch of girls that they didn't know. And so I think that that's a really important piece of this conversation that's often left out. And when I see these trainings happen, mostly on my campus, it's people coming in to tell someone something's wrong with them. And historically, again, it is true that fraternities perpetrate disproportionately. But if you put people in a box for so long, you stereotype them, they start to become that stereotype and they start to be defined by it. And they're not going to want to learn anything or start acting differently if they think, no matter what I do, I'm going to be this person to everyone else. And when you're in a siloed community, you're going to feel like you're boxed into that community. And if you're stereotyped in that silo, then you become that. And so we have to start asking ourselves instead how we can empower them and not how they can empower themselves.
I love that, Ray. Thank you so much for your work. I think back, that reminds me of when we first started PAVE in 2001 was our kickoff meeting. We started to do the Greek trainings, but we were in their weekly meetings with the presidents of the fraternities. We had to train the trainer. And like you said, it just makes such a difference. And just that nuance of being a positive and a proactive approach is saying you all are leaders. You're not the potential abuser, like you are the leaders on campus. And that's the same thing with the athletic trainings that we do. So I thank you for that. I think it makes such a difference. And again, they're not shutting their ears off. They're thinking, oh, okay, well then how can I be a leader? So that's really great. So Yvonne, let me kick it back to you here. So how can we effectively support a person who's experienced sexual violence in a Greek life setting?
Of course, I think, something that Ray mentioned as well as Bonnie, it's really thinking about, even our approach to response of sexual violence is very gendered. We assume it's the woman who's the survivor. We assume the men are the perpetrators. And so with that, our response is very much gendered. And, in some sororities, fraternities, they're required to live in the house if they're a new member, if they're a second year. But if it's chapter violence, which I have unfortunately seen, if we remove a member, all of a sudden they're outed, right? Like, oh my God, why did Susie Q just leave the house? Why did Bobby just leave the house? And so thinking before we're even in a situation, how do we handle that, right? How do we handle if we are supporting a survivor to leave the house so that they're far away? what does that look like ahead of time? Is it actually people have the ability to move out? And I know that might sound, for those who are very into it, like, because sororities and fraternities can also be businesses. They think about the house, and if it's not a full occupancy, what happens with our rent? But that really then takes away the ability to support survivors, but also think about first gen and how we're making. So it goes beyond that. But I think that's one thing. It's like understanding the challenges that are within Greek life. As Ray said, they're very ostracized. And so while I understand we label survivors with certain identities so that we know how we can tackle education, what does education look like? But when we continue saying, oh, it's a fraternity man who raped his fraternity brother, or right, it continues that conversation of them not wanting to even report because, well, here I go, I joined this organization because it really spoke to me, values-based alignment. But if we are always, showing only the bad side of Greek life, then they're not going to want to report it as well, because they feel like, well, is this going to be indirectly victim shaming? Well, you joined that organization. What did you expect? What did you expect if you were dressing that way? And so also thinking about victim blaming. But it's really what are, as Ray said, what are even our own biases about Greek life, even if we are in it or not in it? What are the biases that we bring? Because the biases we bring results in then the programming we create, whether it be, and I totally agree, Bonnie, like campus professionals don't talk. And so we have one group creating the policies, one group trying to enact the policies that they don't even know. And so no one's talking. And so then how are our biases creeping into even how we approach Greek life, sexual violence, education, and then really acknowledging if we're always saying Greek life is so negative, then that also alone, just the stigma of it, they're not going to report because they're not going to want to be part of a chapter that either supported it or had a party where someone got sexually assaulted. And so really, I think it's, of course, it's listening without judgment. It's believing them. It's avoiding the victim blaming. But I think when we really maintaining confidentiality, when we're really thinking about Greek life, is what are our biases that we're bringing to the table? What are the biases that we're assuming on campus? Because as Ray says, sometimes you just end up fulfilling the stereotype. I mean, the reality is our brains don't stop building until they're 25, right? And so when we think about it, if you're always being told something, you're just gonna, unfortunately, well, we're supposed to do this, so let's just do it. We're supposed to be the partiers on campus, so we're just gonna be the partiers. We'll show you. And so it's really thinking about how our biases are even influencing and really thinking about our own campus culture. I think sometimes we really think big picture, but like what makes sense at University of Alabama is not going to make sense at American University in DC. Don't even have football, right? And so really thinking about how our education from a national level, but even the micro level, really talk to who the community is at hand to then be able to really support those survivors.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Yvonne. And then how about you, Bonnie? How can we effectively support a person who's experienced sexual violence in a Greek life setting?
Absolutely. I think first and foremost, we have to remind these students that they are not the experts in this topic. And that's coming from someone who used to do that all the time, right? Like I have to, right? Own your own biases, own your stuff. I'm gonna own my stuff right now. I was the on-campus professional that was calling these fraternity chapter presidents being like, something happened. Oh, you don't know? You have 2 minutes to figure it out before I call you back. Get an answer, get it now. It better be correct. I'm calling you back. Click. Right. And then 2 minutes later, I'd call them back and be like, did you figure it out? Oh, you did? Cute that you got that answer. What are you going to do about it? How are you going to hold them accountable? What, right? I think we put so much pressure on these fraternity and sorority leaders to be perfect, to walk the walk, to talk the talk. If something doesn't align with their values, they better answer for it and answer for it quick and hold accountable and all of these things, that they feel a pressure to do all of those things all the time for any topic. And this is a topic that I look at them as I do these trainings and travel around the country and talk to these over 25,000 students a year. And I look at them and I say, you can be an expert in almost everything except for this. This is not for you to adjudicate, to find out what happened, to street justice. Like, this is not your moment to do that. And I often think like the best way to support them is to shower them in those resources. And also know that they can't just be told the resource, they have to have a connection. Fraternity and sorority life is built off of brotherhood, sisterhood, siblinghood. And if we are selling that connection, building that connection, they're not going to go to Title IX if they don't have a relationship with Title IX. If Bonnie is sitting on high in an office with my door closed all the time, and I have that box, as Ray so eloquently put, right, of what a fraternity man is, and a fraternity man comes in my office and said, I'm a victim survivor, something has happened to me, I think it's one of those moments where we're like, what is that response of that adjudicator, that administrator in that moment, right? There's got to be a relationship there. So I think reminding them that they're not the expert, giving them these resources and giving them the knowledge, skills, and abilities to create a relationship with these resources is vital. Not only that, but how are we showing up for our siblings, right? What I teach across the country is like, I want you to talks with a victim survivor. And talks is a common thing, right? Like anyone who's done this work has heard of talks, TALKS. Thank them for telling you, ask them how you can support them, listen to them, know your resources, and then support whatever they choose to do. And you would like their faces, they're like, oh, I've never heard of that before. And I'm like, this is basic stuff. But again, we have to meet them where they are in the education, in the response, in consent conversations, in everything. And so I think just equipping them to say something that is along the right track, not asking them to do it perfectly, but asking them to try, gives them the words to help their brother or sister or human in a moment of need. Right. So I think you have to give them some of that language, but also remind them they are not the expert in this topic and they've got to utilize those pieces and parts.
I love that, Bonnie. And, of course, we talk about the sisterhood and the brotherhood. And before we get to Ray, I just want to share so many survivors in Greek life that I personally connected with over the, 2 decades of this work have said to me, I would have thought when I disclosed that my sister or my brother would have supported me, believed me because of that sisterhood, because of that brotherhood. And when that wasn't there, I mean, people have said that that lack of support was even more damaging than sometimes the assault itself, because they thought that they had this type of really strong connection. So, Ray, I'd love to hear from you. How can we effectively support a person who's experienced sexual violence in a Greek life setting?
Yeah, so I think a system level, addressing sexual violence in Greek life again, just so that we can better support people in the future. One thing a lot of people don't know about who are outside of Greek life is that there's a judiciary board in most fraternities and sororities. And that judiciary board is in some, again, it depends on the whatever fraternity chapter, whatever sorority chapter it is, all of them are different, are able to adjudicate and have a kind of quasi judicial hearing for people who are accused of sexual assault in a private matter. They can do that, in a matter of 2 days. Somebody can be kicked out without administration being notified necessarily. And so I think we have to accept that that is an option that many people don't know about and embrace it because it is part of Greek life. And to make sure that the people who sit on the judiciary board are trauma informed, are trained for their positions, and are able to communicate with survivors in a way that is sensitive and respectful, because they're just students who are not equipped with the tools that they should be to be handling what is essentially a quasi trial over the course of 2 days for a sexual assault victim. They do not have the skills and nobody is giving them. So I think making sure that the people who sit on the J board have those skills and have that training and feel confident themselves, because I think often they don't feel confident because it's not a process a lot of people even engage in as a sexual assault response since they don't know it exists. But the people I know who have used it have found it a little bit helpful. It can be a double-edged sword because there's no accountability since administration's not involved. But since administration's not involved, if you have a terrible Title IX coordinator and you don't want to go public for so many reasons, it's an amazing way to avoid your abuser if you're a part of Greek life and you don't want to go to socials with them. You want to get them out of the house if you're confident that that fraternity will support you. And they're more likely to support you if they have that training.
I love that. Thank you, Ray. So we've got just a couple minutes left. So I've got a question in the chat. Bonnie, can you reshare what talks means, please?
Happy to, friends. Talks is a simple acronym that I think students, faculty, staff, anyone within a university setting, or really anyone, can use just to respond to a victim survivor. So T, thank them for telling you, just a simple thank you for sharing with me. Thank you for coming to me. I feel honored that you've chosen me to hear this story, right? Also, you can reframe that to thinking of you if it's a follow-up conversation with someone, instead of, thank you for coming to me. If somebody has already disclosed to you, you can be like, hey, I was at this session that PAVE put on. It was amazing. Shout out to PAVE, right? And all of these things, I was thinking of you. And then the A is to ask them one question, and that is, how can I support you? Or what do you need right now? That simple question allows the power to be back in that victim survivor's court in a scenario where they didn't have the power of choice, right? And so you are then giving them choice of what they need or what they choose to do. Then you're going to listen. L of talks is just listen to them. I like to say intently listen. Put your phone away, close your laptop, sit with your hands folded nicely in your lap. Oftentimes in fraternities and sororities, we want to hug, embrace, touch, like be in the moment with our sibling. And I'm like, yeah, that's lovely for like other moments, but this moment, physical touch can be triggering, right? So you just want to intently listen, fold your hands, put them on your lap. And then you have to know your resources. And that can be on and off campus resources, right? I know you're an ambassador for Callisto. Callisto is an amazing resource. So definitely utilize that. Utilize resources like PAVE and their website and some of these other places, right? And then the S is for support them. Whatever they choose to do, they might want to report, they might not want to. They might want to just come to you because they know you love you, trust you, but they get to choose what happens next with their story. And this can be used for victim survivors of sexual violence, absolutely, but this is trauma response 101 is what we see with talks. So you are able to use that at any point in time for that.
I love that. Thanks, Bonnie. And then also, if anybody we have time for maybe one or two questions, if anybody wants to pop that in the chat. But I do want to thank Larissa, who had some great comments about how traditional masculinity has been constructed to include reckless drinking. If anybody wants to speak to that. But I think, we don't have a lot of great examples of healthy masculinity. We work closely with Terry Crews as a PAVE ambassador, and he is a former NFL player and actor, and he talked about how he did buy into toxic masculinity, and now he understands that, and I think is a really powerful, I think when you've lived it and you can speak to that lived experience, I think is really powerful. So does any of our wonderful panelists just want to speak to that?
I'm always happy to jump in when it
Please,
comes to
Bonnie.
these sorts of things. I think, yes, agreed, right? There's this concept of toxic masculinity that has high levels of drinking, sexual conquest, as Yvonne said, right? I also think too, when it comes to fraternity and sorority, again, that box, right? That those labels that we put on people of, well, this is what you're about. I tell fraternity men all the time when I start a conversation with them, fraternity is not your last place to be a boy, it's your first opportunity to be a man. And if you want to have conversations like grown men, the way that you said you did during recruitment before you got here, that's going to include some topics that make you a little uncomfortable. And today's conversation might make you a little uncomfortable because that is how you're growing. It's how you're changing. Now, if you're feeling unsafe, that's a different check-in moment, right? The uncomfortableness versus being unsafe, those are two levels. But I really think it's one of those pieces where we have to look at masculinity as an ever-changing spectrum or dichotomy, right? We can't think of it as just toxic masculinity, is heavy drinking, is this, is that, is all these things. Because like when I went to school, toxic masculinity looks a lot different than what it does for Gen Z and even soon to be into college is Gen Alpha. And so we have to be on the top of the trends as we're talking about those sorts of things as well, to be sure that what we're saying is relevant and of value to these fraternity men.
I love that.
I think to add to that, how are students also feeling empowered to talk back, but also provide education if they are a national organization versus you can start a local fraternity sorority. That is a possibility on some campuses because they are so homogenous, and some of them have the largest chapters in the South. Once again, when we're thinking about that traditional NPC, IFC model. And so then they themselves are then prescribing what is masculinity, where students may be, in New England and in the Northeast who have more of a fluidity when it comes to their masculinity, yet they're entering this fraternity or sorority or hyperfemininity, and they're being told or being educated a certain way, and that does not compute then with what their norms are. And so they may adapt because, right, national fraternity, national sorority, we want to be the same. I want to be brothers with the person in the South, etc. And so I think it's also thinking about how are we, as Bonnie said, adapting to the audience, but also and within that is even thinking about how do we, there has been incredible things that certain chapters and certain campuses have done. I always think of UMD, University of Maryland, that has their 10-man, 10-woman plan, where it's the fraternities and sororities themselves providing that education, being peer educators. There is power within the community, but if we continue to allow certain organizations to prescribe certain things on them, then they're going to want to be that because they want to fit in.
Love that. Thank you so much. We're actually out of time, but we have a really important question so if we can do a quick answer, team, but we have a question from Isabel about any specific thoughts, resources, ideas about addressing harm with LGBTQ plus members of Greek life. So if we can just quickly touch on that before we move to the next session.
Yeah, absolutely. In my position as the LGBTQ plus caucus chair, it's on us. I designed a training where it's about dating apps and online dating safety. And I found that that's a really great way to kind of bridge the homophobia that really still is persistent in Greek life. To have something that's a shared bond at first and a shared understanding helps people engage in a shared conversation and understand where someone else might be coming from and what their experience is. And so the beginning of that training involves a kind of quadrant of dating apps. There's a quadrant of safety. So you have most safe to least safe, and you have most popular to least popular. And often Tinder goes most popular and one of the less safe ones. Grindr is always in the very bottom of both. And so Grindr kind of helps to start that conversation, and we start talking about queer dating and what queer dating looks like and how unsafe it is. And I think it helps that cross understanding for straight people who haven't necessarily experienced or been around other people who are queer, who don't necessarily understand what the experience is like being on an app that has so little protections and so little safety features for you, but is really one of your only options, especially as someone who's not necessarily out yet, because Grindr doesn't require a face picture. And so understanding that and having a discussion around it after everyone sees, people go up and put a sticky note where they think each app falls, and they see all of them are Grindr, and then we start kind of unpacking that. And I found that that starts some really great conversations.
Wonderful. Ray, thank you so much. We are out of time. What a wonderful panel. Thank you all so much, not just for your words here today and your time, but for all the work that you continue to do to make the world a better place. Thank you so very much. And if you want to drop your info in the chat of how people can find you or reach you, social media or whatnot, we would love that. So thank you all so very much, and hope to have you back again next year. So now we are going to be coming into our closing. And I'm excited to welcome back to the stage, our virtual stage, Ashley, who is our Director of Survivor Support here at PAVE. She has a robust and fantastic background in all issues of survivor support. So I'm going to turn it over to Ashley so we can do a little self-care closing. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you. Hello again, everyone. I just dropped in the chat some just national hotlines, information if anyone needs anything like that. But we are just going to do a quick mindfulness moment here. So only take a few moments. I invite you to, sit in whichever way is most comfortable for you and however you're able. But if you can, sit in a comfortable yet upright position in your chair or on your couch. If you can, put your feet flat on the floor, uncross your arms and legs, and rest your hands in your lap. So you can either let your eyes gently close, or you can fix them on a point in front of you. You can fix them on these candles behind me if that works for you. If you want to put your head down. And we're going to take a couple of deep breaths in. So we'll go in and out. And notice the sound and the feel of your own breath as you breathe in again. And out. So pay attention to your breathing as we go through this. We're going to take a moment to connect with our own inner resources. We want to begin by scanning and sensing someone in your life. So find a person or a spiritual figure or someone in your life, whether they are here or no longer here. It can be a pet, an elderly family member, a loved one, and feel their presence right now inside of you, right? Someone who is comforting. Being with this person should provide you with a sense of peace. And you can breathe in and breathe into that person. Who helps you feel the type of love and safety that you most want to access when things are difficult? Continue to breathe into that person. Take some time to imagine and visualize this person or being. Bring your energy, your aura into yourself as you are also breathing into their presence. Are their eyes looking at you? Are they giving you a certain expression? Sense the love and the energy surrounding you when you bring that person into your mind. Take a deep breath in and out. Sense what it means to welcome this feeling. Notice what it's like in your body, in your heart, when you feel the presence of a loving being bathe you. Feel bathed in it. Surround yourself with it. Permeate it. If there are words of comfort that the fearful parts of you would like to hear when you were afraid, imagine this person saying those things. Imagine this being giving you those words. Continue sensing the felt experience of being safe and loved, and then return to this place, to this being in the future, in moments of stress. So breathe in and out. Slowly bring your attention back to the chair, to the couch, to the room. You can gently open your eyes, adjust your focus, and notice what you can see, what you can hear. If you can push your feet into the ground or your hands into your thighs, and if you have a stretch, notice yourself stretching, and welcome back. Remember that you are here in this moment, and no matter what you've been through, you deserve this sense of peace as you move on, move forward with your day, with your weekend. And always remember, when you are feeling stress, breathe into that person, breathe into that sense of love. So we are now reaching our end. I put these in there, in the chat. Here are some more. PAVE has so much amazing stuff coming up, and we're just so grateful for everyone who's been here. We have some QR codes, so let us know what you think. I want to give an amazing special thank you to Cassie. She was our intern for the Red Zone Summit, and she's just incredible. So shout out to you, Cassie. This big old QR code here on the left is a survey for the summit that you attended today. So if you could please click on that, if we could bring it back up. And then the red QR code on the top right here is information about Shattering the Red Zone. So it's all of PAVE's information that we've put out on social media, it's on our website. So many great resources. Eventually the link to this video for this entire summit will be there too. And then this teal QR code here on the bottom is for our upcoming events. We have support groups that I lead. We have the art workshops that you also see me in. We have a BIPOC healing circle. We have a book club. We're doing the book Speak, which many of you may know, and actually really discusses topics related to bystander intervention. And so that's going to be a really good discussion. And we just thank you all so much for being here. I see that, if you have space to care for yourself this, after this or this evening, please do. And with that, we just thank you so much all for coming. Shout out to Elle for creating this amazing presentation. And we wish you all a wonderful rest of your week. Bye-bye.